Okay, well, a few people are still just getting their seats, so I'll just start with a basic intro for the event before I dive into the presentation. So thank you all for coming. My name's Ryan, and I'm the chair of the Maoist Communist Union. We're a pre-party organization here in the United States. And what we mean by pre-party is that we don't think we're yet a vanguard party of the working class. That requires a large scale of organization far beyond what we are at present. But we're an organization which aims to build that. What is the Vanguard Party? It's a party which has really achieved the fusion of Marxism and the working class movement, especially the advanced element of the class. And so what we aim to do is, in our modest way, contribute to the creation of that party. We think we have some good ideas, some good organizing, but that's a big task. And the reason we think there's a need for such a party is, well, really what Lenin says. He says the masses are made up of classes. Classes are led by parties, generally, and parties are led by the best representatives of the class. He says all of this is elementary. Unfortunately, for a very long time in this country, we haven't had a real communist party capable of leading the struggles. And I want to be clear, the vanguard party of the working class, it doesn't just care about the immediate economic interests of the workers, better wages, hours, or conditions, or just the need to overthrow the bourgeoisie, although that is very important. It aims to lead all the popular struggles in the society, all the oppressed groups, strata, and classes, to rally them together to overthrow their common oppressor, the capitalist class, and in the US, the monopoly capitalist class, the imperialists who run this country in a global empire. So hopefully that clarifies a little bit in very general terms of what we aim to do, which is a pretty ambitious goal. And with this war starting, it does seem like, as the title of the event indicates, the empire is unraveling very fast, actually. I don't want to be hyperbolic. We're not about to have revolution tomorrow. We're a very long way from that. But things are moving at a pace globally in terms of the unraveling of the US empire that I didn't imagine we would see in these years. And it's quite an exciting and hopeful thing. I hope by the end of this presentation, you are at least partially convinced of that thesis. Because the dominant sentiment on the US left at present, and I'll get into this a little bit more later, is, oh, this is another bad war. It's another bad thing the US government is doing, Israel's doing. Okay, what else is new? And yeah, that's a good question. The entirety of the existence of Israel from its very founding with the Nakba has been one horrible atrocity after another. And the US government, for our whole lifetimes, has been at war. With one country or another invading, bombing, genociding, etc. But it would be a very, very, very big mistake to believe that what we're witnessing with this war is another Iraq or another Afghanistan. The US lost the war in Afghanistan. What happened? Did our lives change so much? Not really. The US alliance is frayed a little bit. We saw the videos of people. It was compared to the US defeat in Vietnam, people hanging on to helicopters. They flew out of Saigon. But day to day, did our lives change so much? Not really. When the Ukraine war started, not a US war, directly, US proxy war, but did our lives change so much? Inflation went up. There was some discussion of Hunter Biden and Burisma and, the history's back or something. I don't know. That was kind of like the liberal press. Things didn't change so much. Things are about to change in the world very quickly. In fact, they already have, although the relative insulation, both in the media bubble here in the US and also at relative economic strength of the US, and it's the most powerful imperialist country in the world, means that the immediate effects aren't going to be as sharp here as, say, in the Middle East, but they're going to be pretty big here. So let's get into it. Okay, we have this lovely picture of Trump and Bibi for our agenda. So I'll give some background on the war. We'll talk about why launch this war, as I aim to show that actually the US government knew, or at least sections of it knew very, very well, this war was about to be a disaster. Then I'll show you all just how much of a disaster this war really is. And it's a basically abject failure when we're 5 days in, and it's just getting started. And then we'll talk about the nuclear question, because the escalation chain has moved at such a rapid pace, the US government is seriously contemplating the use of nuclear weapons here. Likely so-called tactical nukes, which are not city killers being to destroy enemy military installations, but city killers could be on the table, especially with the Israeli tornado doctrine in effect. We'll talk about that. And we'll talk about, well, what do you do then? Like, that's terrifying in a certain sense, but it's not, hopefully, the end of the world. We'll talk about the economic fallout, which will be severe, and then we'll talk about the redivision of the world. And the ongoing and just getting started mass rebellion. Okay, so let's start with believe. So what's the basic thesis here? The US is fucked. I don't know how else to put it. I mean, Rubio let the cat out of the bag and they had to deny it. How many interceptors did the US produce a month? Missile interceptors? 6 or 7. How many ballistic missiles does Iran make a month? 100, 200, something like that. How many drones does Iran make a month? 400. What are these drones launched from? Indiscriminate box trucks, other vehicles, can't really tell. How many drones does Iran have? 80,000 at the start of the war. Officially, probably more. How many have they used so far? 1,000. How much do those drones cost? Just 1,000 so far. How much does a missile interceptor cost? $1 million more. And that's just for the missile interceptor. Forget about all the cost of running and GPS, etc. The Brits posted this video. It's like, we got in the war. Yeah, we're doing good defensive action. As soon as Keir Starmer said the Brits were in the war, Iranians hit the secret British Air Force bases in Cyprus. Not so secret. The Brits posted a video of them flying an F-35. Big victory video. They shot down an Iranian drone. What? Used the most advanced, or maybe second or third most advanced, I don't know, fighter bomber in the world to shoot down a $10,000 drone? Like, why are you bragging about that? The cost of just taking the F-35 off for 1 second is more than the whole drone. But that also shows how depleted the air defense is. The Gulf countries are basically out of air defense munitions. The US will soon be if they aren't already in the region. They have more around the world, and we'll get into this, but they cannot quickly resupply them. And if you put the entirety of the US empire's air defense through the wood chipper, and you have a resupply rate of 6 to 7 a month, even if you double that, which they've been trying to do since when? 2023? 2022, the start of the Ukraine war, actually, so 4 years. And they haven't succeeded. They said, look, get to 1,000 a year eventually. In 2058, I don't know. They're going to run out of missiles. Actually, a huge portion of their reserves in the Middle East have already been depleted. And then what happens? All the US targets start getting hit around the region. And we'll get to that. Don't believe me? Look at this image. Okay, this, to be fair, is actually from December. It's Trump yelling at Hegseth, but it's been circulating again. Trump is furious. And if you see his demeanor at the press conferences or Hegseth's thing, it's insane. They're like, Trump's like, it's a war. Hegseth's like, it's not a war, it's a special military operation. Reporters like, isn't that what Putin said? They're like, shut up, it's not a war. It is a war. We're winning. We're not gonna put boots on the ground. We are gonna put boots on the ground. We're gonna fight it forever. No more forever wars. We're not putting boots on the ground. We're doing this because they were gonna do a preemptive strike on us, so we hit them first. We're doing it because Israel asked us to. No, we're not. In fact, we forced Israel to do this. Every press conference is a different thing. What are the objectives? We've already said we have objectives. What are they? Regime change. And then things are going poorly. This came out yesterday morning, 2 days ago. Hegseth briefed the troops. Now, for those who are not aware, it's been a standard part of US military training since the end of World War II to train troops to be ready to follow orders and run into a nuclear explosion. Drop a nuke and then send the troops in. But they hope that this will drum up support for the troops to be put through the meat grinder. And as I noted, the escalation chain is proceeding extremely rapidly. And I'll talk more about this in a minute, but there's a basic military doctrine employed by the US military since the early 70s, really adopted widespread as they tried to sum up how the hell they lost so bad in Vietnam. And it's called OODA, Observe, Orient, Decide, Act. And they have this chain they're supposed to go through to make decisions. And they've published a lot of papers on how they respond. And Iran basically jumped way up the escalation chain and then to systematically dismantle the US's ability to run through their OODA loop, as it's known, and make decisions effectively. Don't believe me? Yesterday, Trump had a phone call with some Kurdish groups in Iraq about arming them. What happened as soon as that phone call ended? Iranian forces and Iraqi forces aligned with Iran, some of the popular mobilization units, started hitting the Kurdish bases in the region that were potentially going to side with the US. Today, some of them said they're not going to actually support the US. Others are saying they're going to do a ground invasion of Iran. Iran is moving and making decisions in minutes. The US is making decisions on a days or weeks scale. And in order to deal with any sort of production chain that would allow them to effectively fight this war, they need months or years. And years haven't been enough to really increase military production. So that's the basic lead. The US is losing bad. And we'll get into the details of that, but it's really bad for the US and Israel right now. Like unprecedented level of defeat. And I'll share the information that exists and has gotten through the censorship in the regions, and especially in Israel, which is the only country the US does not allow the sale of high quality satellite imagery of. The only country in the world that you could sell high quality satellite imagery to the US, but not Israel. So why is this happening? And I haven't convinced you of the thesis, but I'm going to explain why I think this defeat is happening, the idiocy of going to this war, which imperialist war always involves some idiocy, but this is not Iraq 1 or 2 or 3 when they go back in after the counterterrorism plus of just drone striking the country and hoping that would work, that Obama came up with. Didn't work. This is something else. So why make such a stupid decision? Like some people said, oh, this doesn't make any sense. Why would the imperialists implode their empire and fight a war they're so obviously going to lose when they were saying beforehand they're going to lose? They must be coordinating this. And if you've seen online, some people have been saying this is all for show. It's just like a big thing so Trump can satisfy the Israelis or something. I don't know. The first is that there's real imperialist arrogance. Now, I want to be clear about that. This is not a question of Trump's individual subjective temperament. I mean, that's a factor. What I mean is a bit different. There's structural problems in the US empire. For example, if you go back to Nixon, every single president the US has seen since then, every single president for the last 50 plus years has issued more executive orders than the last. Way more, actually. This has been an objective requirement of the ruling class. Congress is deadlocked, there's lack of confidence in Congress, there's all these problems, actually, in the systems of checks and balances that they have. So what do? Concentrate more and more decision-making power into the executive. It leads to certain problems. Individuals actually have a bigger sway. But also the very nature of the US bureaucracy has changed significantly. There's been lots of cuts, there's a lot less objectivity, there's a lot more open corruption. I mean, presidents have been corrupt. I mean, read about Lyndon Johnson. That man was extremely corrupt. But it's a different thing to have the White House rigging the length of press conferences so they can win $1 million bets on Kalshi and Polymarket. I mean, that's where we're at right now. Trump basically, when Hunter Biden's corruption, that was kind of like hush-hush a little bit. It was a big scandal that there was the emails 10% for the big man, and Hunter was doing these terrible paintings that everyone was giving money to. Trump opened up a fucking meme coin, and everyone poured money into it, and he knew who it was, and then the thing crashed. They have the American Bitcoin company. I mean, the level of corruption is unprecedented. It's open. So this indicates the structural decay in the US society overall, and in the ruling class in particular. And we can see the arrogance here in the fact that they've massively underestimated Iran. They didn't believe the Iranians would hit back. They thought it would be like Venezuela. They said as much. Now, Venezuela, for those who aren't aware, and the Venezuelan government's statement basically supporting the US and Israel here and make this 100% clear, Delcy Rodriguez, and maybe even Maduro himself, it's not clear, cut a deal with the US. And they're now towing the CIA-US line with a little bit of light distance from it. The Iranian government was not willing to do that. They were not willing to surrender. And the Iranian population is not willing to surrender. Not that the Venezuelan people wouldn't have fought heroically if the US had invaded. I'm sure they would have. But the level of commitment to not being made a US colony again in Iran is very strong. I mean, they remember what it was like under the Shah. They fought very hard against that regime and eventually overthrew it. And while the present government has a number of different issues, let's just be real. It's a hell of a lot worse to be a US-Israeli colony or to have your country Balkanized. I mean, literally, look at what happens. We call it Balkanization. Look what happened in the Balkans. Iran responded extremely decisively. I mentioned this earlier, but the US had war gamed this thing out. And we'll talk about US war games and US war games with Iran a little bit later. But they believed that Iran would respond roughly in kind. They'd had the little 12-day war thing, and the US hit some facilities they warned Iran in advance of, and Israel tried to escalate it a bit, and Trump backed off from the escalation. And so they expected a similar response, a bit symbolic, maybe hit a few targets. I think Iran did some damage to Israel in response in the 12-day war, but Iran jumped 3 steps up the escalation chain. And rightly so. If the US attacks, are you just gonna play by the rule book that they expect you to play by? No, Iran hit extremely quickly and decisively the US bases in the area, and in particular the key radar facilities that are essential for the US maintaining its combat effectiveness and operability throughout the region. For those who don't know, the US military operates on an extremely centralized system of decision-making, which requires basically top-down chain of command, access to a large array of information. A huge portion of things get fed into a big system that relies on a bunch of radar arrays, GPS, etc. Iran targeted those radar arrays, and we'll talk about how many they've destroyed. It's staggering. And then they've also been engaged in, I think, fairly sophisticated GPS jamming. And if the US doesn't have the GPS stuff, the precision-guided missiles don't work. So the bombs the US has been dropping on Iran, at least a good portion of them, are being dropped without their GPS guidance system, which means they're no longer smart bombs. Why? Because if the GPS jamming is off, you can't really guarantee it's hitting where you think it's hitting. So if the GPS jamming is on, if the GPS system isn't working. The US did not anticipate these things and was caught very flat-footed, and then has been flailing about trying to respond. At present, the US is facing, and is just beginning to face, we're 5 days in, but I feel very confident that events over the last day only reinforce this. It's worst military defeat ever. Maybe, you'd argue the War of 1812, the US got hit pretty bad, I don't know. But if we're digging that, it's way worse than Vietnam. Because in Vietnam, the US had to retreat from Vietnam. Were US military bases around the region destroyed? No. And this is just getting started. We're 5 days in. We're 5 days in. Bahrain, Qatar, UAE bases, they're gone, or effectively gone. US Embassy and CIA headquarters burned in Saudi Arabia. CIA built a base in UAE, found and destroyed. US key personnel meeting secretly in a hotel, droned while they were meeting. A bunch of them, actually, in different hotels. The US ruling class, the Trump administration, the military broadly, they did not prepare for this. They have contingency plans, but they did not expect this. And it's a very distinct possibility. There's a lot of variables and factors, but it's a very distinct possibility, and I really want people to understand the gravity of this, that the US will have to book a large-scale retreat from the Middle East. I don't mean the US empire ends. I don't want to be hyperbolic. I don't mean the US is done, is no longer a world power. But could you imagine the dozens of US military bases that we know of around the Middle East, some of them being no longer operative, countries kicking the US out? Because that's what's really on the table right now. And in fact, those bases, many of them are not operative. The 5th Fleet Command in Bahrain, which is the sort of central command for the US Navy in the region, is called the US's unsinkable aircraft carrier, is done. It's been destroyed. It's non-functional. The US has booked a retreat from there, by and large. And that's in 5 days. It's staggering. And I'll show you some images and we'll talk about some of this stuff in a minute, but I just want to give you all a sense and then we'll go through the details to support this argument. Israel's continued existence is at this point an open question, which is non-trivial because Israel has an explicit, although still somewhat secret, although not really secret since Seymour Hersh is reporting on it in the 80s, an explicit doctrine called the Samson option, which is if the existence of Israel is ever threatened with nuclear or conventional weapons, Israel will hold the whole world hostage by destroying it with nuclear weapons, or threatening to do so. But Israel is facing such a beating right now, it's hard to describe. And we'll get into that. I don't mean that Israel's definitely not going to exist. I want to be clear. But Israel's being hit extremely, extremely hard. And I'll show you some of it. And again, we're 5 days in, and Iran's only launched 1,000 drones. Now, Iran won't want to deplete all of their supplies. They need those for defense going forward. But they've been very clear that in terms of the drones and the missiles, the advanced stuff has basically not really been used yet. And the Iron Dome's almost depleted. And for those who didn't follow it, about 24 hours ago, about 48 hours ago, Israel called up 100,000 reservists. Those reservists were then prepared, and some of them sent into, along with some active duty troops, into Lebanon to prepare for a ground invasion. Israel expected to swiftly move into Lebanon and dismantle what they believed to be the remnants of Hezbollah. They found that Hezbollah was extremely well prepared for them, that despite killing Nasrallah and others, that Hezbollah was an extremely effective fighting force. Hezbollah started launching Shahed drones and cruise missiles, which Israel didn't know they had either of those, from what I can tell, into Israel, into Cyprus in coordination with the Iranian strikes. Israel destroyed at least 5 tanks, although it's a crime in many countries, including the UK, to publish evidence of that. And Israel booked a significant retreat. And this is in Israeli media, what's gotten out. So that's what the Israelis are even saying themselves right now, that they underestimated how strong Hezbollah was.
They destroyed the Israeli tanks?
5 Israeli tanks were destroyed, sorry, at least that we know of. But you can't publish that, like Richard Medhurst, a journalist who was already attacked by the UK under national security laws for publishing basic things about what's happening with Israel, was basically saying on his Twitter, I can't publish the photos of this and videos of this because the UK government will arrest me. Pretty surreal. The whole map of world alliances is being redrawn, just beginning to be redrawn. Spain, a long-standing US ally, kicked the US planes out of Spain. France, although involved in the war effort, condemned this as illegal and announced that they will be building their own nuclear arsenal up hugely and will not disclose the size of it. And they will try to bring the whole of the EU under their nuclear umbrella, effectively rendering redundant and irrelevant the US nuclear umbrella. This is a statement that France will really pursue aggressively strategic autonomy. I'm not saying they'll succeed, but this is an unprecedented statement. The last time France took this strong of a stand against the US, anyone know? When they first developed nuclear weapons under de Gaulle, which helped to bring about the crisis, that and amongst a series of other factors, that led to the collapse of the immediate post-World War II order, the Bretton Woods system, and the mass withdrawal of gold reserves from the US and foreign countries that played a major role in creating the currency crisis that helped drive the stagflation in the US of the 70s. That is the scale of crisis, just to give a sense, that the US is facing at present. The US kept being a permanent power after that, but it was severely hurt by it. The scale may be even bigger now in a certain sense because of the nature of the military defeat. And so what about nukes? And again, I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but let's be clear. What do you think the US population would do if the US decided to nuke Iran? I mean, maybe people would just be like, oh, whatever, back to watching AI slop and playing Fortnite and watching porn or something. I don't know. My guess is there would be mass outrage because people would have some sense this is different. I'm sure some people would still be tuned out, but this would be different. But also around the world. The US has only, properly speaking, used nuclear weapons once in World War II. Now they've used them in another sense, like when you use a gun to rob a store but you don't shoot anyone, they're still using them. But to actually detonate the nukes here would be extremely costly. It also probably wouldn't win the US much. Iran is a pretty big country. One nuke is not ending this war, and they've declared their intention to fight to the death. And there's a real strong religious culture of martyrdom there, which is depicted in the US media as insanity, but the culture of martyrdom is not necessarily religious, and it's certainly not insane. People still remember and talk openly about the martyrdom of Hussein, who was killed 1,400 years ago. That's still a major cultural reference point in Iran. So if the US nukes a bunch of people, I don't think that wins the war. This is not the Japanese Empire collapsing at the end of World War II, already ready to surrender. But the US and Israel may nuke anyways. And there's some questions, tactical or city killer, what's the response? There's a bunch of variables there. We're not going to get into all of them. My point is, I don't think nukes win the US this war. Okay, so with all that said, we'll get into the details a little more, but first, a little segment in red, white, and blue of how not to understand the war. Let me a little barley tea. Okay, anyone been following the New York Times headlines lately? Because if you have, probably this is all news to you. You maybe heard a little bit about missiles, not enough missiles, Trump's a bad guy. Here's a great New York Times headline. Is it legal or illegal to assassinate a foreign leader, bomb his house, and kill his children and grandchildren? If it's legal, is it fine? I mean, it's pretty surreal. Leaving aside even the whole question of the fact that international law, as it stands, was established in the post-World War II order explicitly by the US empire to aid its interest. Leaving aside the fact the US violates this international law anyways all the time, international law, whatever nice and well-meaning people in the UN may say, really can't be our standard for A, what's right and wrong, but also B, what makes sense or doesn't make sense politically. And, it's also surreal that, again, if there was a law that said it's fine to kill him, would that make it okay? But this is the sort of really highbrow debate that happens in the New York Times every day. On the other hand, we have this great column from Bret Stephens. Actually, the US is stronger when anti-American dictators have solid reasons to fear us. First of all, implicitly in the framing is pro-American dictators, 2 thumbs up. We love that Saudi monarchy. But you see the actual headline of it. With Iran, Trump and Netanyahu are doing the free world a favor. it's hard for them to even call it the free world at this point. We have this much journalistic censorship and so on. Palantir digital IDs coming soon to a neighborhood near you. Then there's everyone's favorite left liberal outlet, Democracy Now! Oh, it definitely is against international law. Well, that's a relief. I read the New York Times and I wasn't sure, but Democracy Now! Has really clarified this to me. And then there's, of course, CENTCOM statements. There's been no U.S. casualties. They ignored that hotel full of U.S. commanders that was blown up. And then they later said, okay, there's a couple. Probably hundreds at this point.
And yeah, aren't they only saying it's like 4 or 5?
Yeah, they say it's like 5 or 6. But the meeting that was hit was of the commanding officers, one of the meetings that was hit was of the commanding officers and maybe also CIA people in Bahrain. So even if that is only 5 of them, and I don't think it is, 5 commanding officers, how do you think the US Navy's doing in an extremely top-down structure? Anyone have any history in the military? For those who don't know, you're not really supposed to be asking many questions. You follow orders. The people above you, they decide, and maybe you have a tiny bit if you're like an NCO or something, or a major, some decision-making power, but in contrast, this is an important piece of contrast, have people heard of the Mosaic defense system? Iran has a structure in their military, and we'll talk a bit more about this later, where basically they have general directives and overall strategy and tactics and plans, contingency plans. And throughout this whole war, actually, since the start of it, they activated this thing they call the Mosaic defense system, whereby there's not centralized orders being given. In light of the general principles and overall strategy and tactics, people are supposed to make decisions accordingly at a certain level of leadership, so maybe like local generals or colonels or whatever. So they're actually supposed to think and decide based on their understanding of what the objectives of the war are, what the strategy is, what the enemy's weak points and strengths are, and so on. If you believe that people can think and decide or are intelligent, that's a basic way to run your military. If you believe people are idiots who just need to be told what to do and only a small portion of people, the geniuses, can really lead, then you run the military like the US. And those genius generals and CIA heads like Petraeus, how did they do in the last few years or decades with US wars? They lost every single one and kept getting promoted. And this is another structural problem. I referred to the arrogance earlier, and I forgot to mention this, that the US military, you lose, you mess up, you get a bunch of people killed, you get promoted over and over and over again. Was there any real accountability? No, there was this thing briefly called SIGAR, which is Special Investigative General on the Afghan War, and they did some real investigation into what the hell went wrong. And you know what the US military decided after that? First, we're not going to implement any of the suggestions. And second, no body like this should ever exist again. They literally we can't have an investigation into why we fucked up. And if you read the SIGAR reports, they're extremely interesting. We wrote a paper on the defeat in Afghanistan that drew heavily on those reports. They give a sense of how much of a disaster a lot of the US policy was. The US military made no major changes. The few generals who were more critical, and I'm not saying these are progressive people, but people like Michael Flynn, who's now promoting QAnon stuff. He doesn't really believe it, but he promotes it to try to gain power. He was one of the people who was more critical, and he spoke frankly about some of the idiocy of the other generals. What happened to him? He was going to be actually Trump's Secretary of Defense in his first term, and then the FBI basically entrapped him and tried to force him to say he committed a crime and bankrupt him through legal fees, and he backed out of being in the government. And he was kind of iced out. No, the guy sucks. He did go on the record and talk about Obama's disastrous Syria plan to Seymour Hersh, which is pretty interesting to read. But that sort of critical pro-US empire mind was not accepted in the Pentagon. So you get a sense of what yes men they look for. This is the Times from today. There will be no let up on attacks in Iran until you run out of missiles. But let's take a look right up here on the right. Iran's secret outreach highlights Trump's challenge. I don't know if people saw this article today. The Times said they got notified that secretly Iran actually wants a ceasefire. They're bending under US pressure. Iran immediately said this is bullshit. Because actually it's the opposite. Immediately after the strike that killed Khomeini, when the Iranians started hitting the US, Trump freaked out and said, let's have a ceasefire, let's have a ceasefire. And Iran said, Trump called us for a ceasefire. We have no interest in a ceasefire. We will decide the time and place this war ends, not Trump, which is accurate. Why, when you're winning on every single front, would you seek a ceasefire? Only if you read the New York Times and the various other pro-US empire papers, whether they be a flavor of Democrat or Republican, would you believe that maybe the US is winning? And even that illusion will end soon in those papers. And if we look at the article here, you can see a little bit. Oh, the CIA, they reached out indirectly to the CIA. It's a classic New York Times piece. We heard from the CIA something. Here's the CIA's info to us. Like literal mouthpiece for the CIA. And this is actually, unfortunately, the typical way the New York Times runs these days. Seymour Hersh, when he was at the Times back in the 70s, noted his horror at realizing that his editor, all of his secret sources in the White House, was just Henry Kissinger calling up and saying, hey, let me just tell you what's really going on. And the guy uncritically published it. Yeah, it's pretty surreal. So here's what an Iranian news agency said. It's pure fabrication. It's totally untrue. And that's just the basic reality of it. And again, this becomes a lot clearer once you see the details of actually what's happening in the war. Okay, but let's just talk briefly about, before we get into the details of the war, just a basic principle to help guide us. And for this principle, we'll look to Lenin. And so Lenin, in his text Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capital, or of Capitalism, notes, what means other than war could there be under capitalism to overcome the disparity between the development of the productive forces and the accumulation of capital on the one side, and the division of colonies and spheres of influence for finance on the other? Now, okay, this sounds maybe intimidating, or what's productive forces, accumulation of capital, our eyes can kind of glaze over, but it's not so complicated. Now, Lenin's talking about a fairly different situation than right now, and I'll get into that a bit and then try to explain some of the differences. But what he's saying is, look, and he's writing this in the midst of World War I. Before World War I, there was a lot of the old colonial powers. And once capitalism had really developed into its monopoly phase around the rise of the 20th century, the world was divided up. You know, Britain had some colonies, France had some colonies. Maybe you all have heard of the race for Africa. Some of the other European powers like, oh shit, let's grab some colonies in Africa before the whole world is seized. Late to the game of loot and plunder and rape and pillage. And then the world was divided up between these different powers of different strengths. Now, some of the powers were rising powers. For example, the US and Germany at the time. They had a higher rate of profit, they didn't have as many old factories, they had new state-of-the-art factories. In contrast, in Britain and France, the factories were actually a lot older. The rate of profit had fallen. The productive forces were developing much quicker in Germany and in the US. And so by the law of capital, these, in terms of like fair share based on how much power you've accumulated, how much dead labor you've sucked from your population and put in the hands of the billionaires or millionaires at that time, how much of the share of the world should you have? Well, Germany, the US, others were rising, said we should have more. Japan. Did the old powers want to give that up? No, Britain's not going to give up their colonies. They spent a lot of indigenous people's lives to hold on to those. They killed a lot of people to hold on to them. I mean, according to some estimates in the late Victorian period, about 90 million is known as the late Victorian Holocaust. Pretty brutal. They're willing to kill those people to get the colonies, they're not about to let them go. And so eventually this led up to World War I, clash between the great powers of the day. Now, I want to be clear, Iran is not a power like the US. But is the US about to give up the Middle East, even as a declining empire, peacefully? No, absolutely not. Show of hands, who saw, or at least saw about Tucker Carlson's disastrous interview with Mike Huckabee? I mean, it was incredible. And Mike Huckabee is really dumb. And if people didn't see, he put out an AI statement about how to evacuate for everyone in Israel. The man is so stupid. And Tucker played him like a fiddle. And Huckabee basically supported, based on like some lines in Genesis, which he couldn't even keep straight, Abraham or Abram, like two different people in the Bible. He didn't know the difference. Real great Christian, that Israel should span from the Nile to the Euphrates. And he just kept saying it. Tucker's like, what are you basing this on? Now, I want to be clear. First, Tucker is a U.S. imperialist. He's got ties to the CIA. His father worked at Voice of America. He represents a certain faction of the U.S. imperialists who don't want to just do whatever Israel says. And I'm being a bit hyperbolic, that's not quite how it works. but they're more critical of Israel. They want to align more with Qatar and Saudi Arabia. And there's a series of different interests in the US ruling class. They're not unified, actually, believe it or not. Some of them are like, damn, this kind of crazy little ethno-state we've built in the desert probably shouldn't just do its bidding, even if it means ruining our international relations. And some of them think that. Of course, they're willing to commit genocide too, and so on. I'm not talking about Tucker personally necessarily, but the section of the ruling class. But after Huckabee's interview, Tucker put out a statement on the war. How many people watched that? Came out yesterday. I think it was yesterday, maybe it was 2 days ago. I listened to a decent amount of it. What Tucker says is, look, the US is a great power. It's on the decline. That's the reality. The US needs to work out, he says we, but he means the US ruling class, needs to work out a power sharing agreement with China. He says China's a rising great power, you just have to accept that. And there needs to be negotiations so we don't have World War III to redivide the world. This is a very common view amongst the US ruling class. Kissinger supported this view. So it's not a progressive view. I want to be clear. And maybe the people who don't want to go to World War III, but these are not progressive people. But this is part of what we're seeing here, actually. And there's a reason that China has been providing significant support to Iran. Now, I want to be clear. The Iranians are fighting this war, and they're fighting well, and they're fighting, frankly, courageously against the US empire. And a good deal of people who have gotten support from the Iranians, but are not reducible to Iranian puppets, have been fighting in Iraq, in Lebanon, Hezbollah. They're an indigenous force in a certain sense to like the region. They're not Iranian proxies, as they're typically described. They're allied, but they're not reducible to like a pawn by Iran. But China has been providing a lot of support to the Iranian government. They provided real-time satellite intelligence. They're publishing the satellite photos of the US bases being destroyed. And there's rumors, it's not totally confirmed, but they helped sell a bunch of military hardware to Iran. And the Chinese ruling class wants to gobble up anything the US loses. They've been competing effectively with the US, going head-to-head with them without directly confronting them militarily. And if the US fucks up here, and the US is fucking up, and leaves the region, it will create a vacuum. Now, some of that vacuum, the people will gain some breathing room. But we should be clear, too, that it's not like a rival imperialist power is just going to let some territory be free. They're going to try to gobble that shit up, invest more in it, and so on. You can see where the US has neglected in terms of investment and domination, places in Africa, Chinese capital has flowed, and even in Latin America, as those who saw in the presentation I gave on the US attack on Venezuela, China's a bigger trading partner with many of these countries and invests more in them now than the US does. Okay, so that's kind of in the background. My main point here is there's this US-China competition in the background. We're not really going to talk about that so much today. But the US empire is acutely aware that even if they're going to kind of lose their territory, someone else might gobble it up. So they don't want to give it up. Like, it's our empire. We built it. We sacrificed so many people around the world for it. Literally, like, sent US troops to die, but slaughtered millions of people in Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. Not to mention how many people died, not in war, but from early deaths, hunger, sickness, malnutrition, etc., preventable diseases because of the poverty that capitalism shackles them with. And so the US imperialists, they do not want to peacefully cede any ground, even when the writing's on the wall. And most of them will not accept a negotiated settlement, even if some, like Tucker, advocate for it. Okay, so let's do a brief historical review. For those who don't know, when's the first time that Netanyahu said that Iran was about to get nuclear weapons? And I don't want to show a bunch of pictures of Netanyahu. You can basically show one of him doing this for every single year. But so here's a New York Times article. Iran closes in on a nuclear bomb 2003. They're almost there. Here's his infamous US speech, 2012. They're just months away from a nuclear weapon. We've reached the final stage. And people see every time he has more elaborate infographics. Oh, they're almost there, they're almost there. And, it's not just Netanyahu, although he's the most, like cartoonishly villainous character. We also have Anthony Blinken. You know what Blinken wrote his doctoral thesis on in the 80s? It was basically a, almost love letter to Henry Kissinger and how amazing Henry Kissinger's foreign policy was. This is maybe the all-time low of Kissinger's popularity before he was somewhat rehabilitated in the Trump era as a moderate alternative or something. I don't know. Kind of the liberal mindset of these things is a little crazy, hard to understand. But yeah, Blinken, he's right out of that cloth. But yeah, so he repeated this. The Biden administration repeated it. And it's so absurd that there's actually a lot of memes like this. Ancient Israelite trad headlets finally translated. Iran is just weeks away from developing a nuclear weapon. Now, it's a funny joke. It's also important to remember there's no real continuity between the population that lived in that area and the Israeli state. Not that some of the people who live there today don't have heritage from the region, but the vast majority don't. Netanyahu's family is Polish. That's why it's illegal to publish the results of your DNA test in Israel, because so much of the population is not from there. This whole fantasy, even if it was true, it wouldn't make any sense. So if someone lived here 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago, so I get to kick you off your land and genocide you? I mean, come on. Okay, so we know that they've been just saying this over and over and over again. And the Israeli ruling class, and they do this for a few reasons. One, they want more U.S. weapons, money, funding, etc. But they also do want to fight a war with Iran. They've wanted it for a long time, at least a section of them. And Netanyahu came to power and really solidified his hold in the Israeli state in the early 2000s. And there was this effort basically to reset Israeli politics, to go against the so-called labor parties in Israel. It's kind of vague social democratic stuff some of the parties supported, and consolidate an openly neoconservative, reactionary government in Israel. Now, not to say Israel wasn't doing horrible things domestically before, but it's a different thing to be openly yeah, we love genocide, and not oh, we're defending ourselves. And Netanyahu basically argued for that sort of policies. And most of the ruling class lined up behind him. This question of war with Iran, how to put it, what do they hope to accomplish effectively? It seems crazy, in light of what's happening now, and in light of the fact that Iran's 92 million people, Israel's a tiny little thing the size of New Jersey, Iran's huge. But they actually believe that through a war with Iran, they can divide Iran into a bunch of tiny little statelets. And you don't have to believe me, this was actually recently published in a policy paper in 2021 by this woman, Brenda Schaefer. She also published the Spark Notes version of this paper, which is fairly long, in the Daily Wire, Ben Shapiro's little news service. Yeah. And you can see, I just highlighted a few things from the policy recommendations. The intelligence community, the CIA and NSA, should assess Iran's ethnic minorities and hold hearings on them. And they should really focus on building influence amongst these groups. I mean, this is a plan for a color revolution, a balkanization, and a bloody ethnic war to divide Iran. This shouldn't be surprising in the plans they talked about for splitting up Russia, which is a great power, an imperialist country. They've actually laid a similar framework, rip the country apart along ethnic lines, have people mass murder each other, and then pick up the pieces. And so this is kind of what the Israeli ruling class and a section of the US ruling class really wants to do to Iran. And that'd be how. I mean, you saw the results. We saw the results when former Yugoslavia was broken up. Yeah. Okay, so why haven't they done this? Why is the US ruling class till now held off? I mean, Iran was part of the axis of evil after 9/11, the whole war on terror. There was basically casus belli to go wherever. And, they could just make up WMDs. We saw they did that before. That was feasible then to convince the American public. People are a little more cynical now. Actually, a lot more cynical. That has a divided character, but that's good that people don't trust the government so much. Why not? Does anyone know who this general is? This is General Paul von Ripper. He was a U.S. general who fought in Vietnam, not as a general. He got promoted afterwards. And in a certain way, not so different than some others I was referring to at the Pentagon who got iced out, he was something of a guy who was willing to go against the tide of the institution he was a part of. Again, not in the sense of opposing U.S. imperialism, but opposing the most idiotic bureaucratic garbage that is the standard operating procedure for the Pentagon. In 2002, the United States government staged, to that date, the most expensive war games in history. It was called the Millennium Challenge. And in it, the US government would be fighting against a country, a Middle Eastern adversary, of whom they didn't say, but it was obviously Iran. And von Ripper was charged with playing the Iranian government. And he was fairly familiar with the methods the Vietnamese used, having fought in the war to fight against the US government and what worked. And so he established on his side a plan. They wouldn't use electronic communications. They would use basically a series of asymmetric advantages they had to create local advantages against a globally superior enemy. He'd read, as most generals do, texts like On Protracted War by Mao and others to get a sense of basic military strategy that forces will use when they're weaker. And he set up a system of couriers for his forces. The US generals on the other side of the war games believed the false electronic communications that he was sending were true. They believed that his misdirections were true. And within 24 hours, he had sunk, like in the war games, not actually literally sunk, but sunk the majority of the US fleet. And so what did the US do? They ran that shit back. And they put 1 million restrictions on Von Ripper and said, you can't do this or that or that or that. And he said, guys, what the fuck are you talking about? If we're gonna go to war with Iran, you're telling me I can't use the tactics we're basically certain they're gonna use? And they said, not explicitly, but they said, we're putting a lot of money in this. We're not gonna lose our own war game. We look like fools. So he quit, and he leaked it. This is from the Army Times. This is an article about him leaking this and complaining about how it was rigged against him. He wasn't gonna do the war games, it was rigged against him. If you go to find this article on the Wayback Machine, it's removed. I don't know if you all know the Wayback Machine, like a bunch of stuff will be taken down at the request of the government. You can still find it using other archive services. There's a few articles in The Guardian and other places about it, but it's notable this was such an embarrassing defeat. They removed it from the Army Times, and they removed it from the Internet Archive, because actually the US military didn't want people to know about their own war games. Now, in 2002, the Iranian military was far, far less sophisticated than it is today. What was the best US jet in the arsenal in 2002? It was the 5th generation air superiority fighter, the F-22. And what's the best jet right now in the US military? In terms of dogfighting? The 5th generation air superiority fighter, the F-22. Now the US has the F-35, but that's not an air superiority fighter, it doesn't dogfight, it's a fighter bomber. And there's some advances the US has made in military technology. But overall, the gap has massively closed between the US military, at least the forces it can reasonably deploy locally in the region while maintaining a global empire, and Iran. That's not to say Iran is equal to the US or anything like that. But my point is, if using good strategy and tactics for asymmetric warfare, Iran could defeat the US military in 2002, according to the US military's own estimates, they can definitely defeat them now. And Iran has developed a whole bunch of specialized drones and ships and a whole bunch of other things to defeat the US. The Shahed drones, for example. They based this off of a US drone that was shot down that they captured. But then they totally reworked it. They got some of the basic drone technology from that. The Shahed drone is so good, the Russians now use it, and now the US has created a version of it. The US copied the Iranians' drones. And the Shaheds are not the best Iranian drones. Actually, they fly fairly slowly, etc. The Iranian Navy is a bunch of basically small ships designed to have this mosquito swarm effect around a US carrier to destroy it. Now, they haven't been fighting against the carriers yet, other than firing a few cruise missiles that hit the USS Abraham Lincoln and caused it to have to retreat to the Indian Ocean. But these ships are very powerful tactic. Against an aircraft carrier. Iran doesn't have aircraft carriers. And so the US developed a littoral combat ship in Bath, Maine. It was a ship meant to counter the Iranian swarms, kind of a metagame. You have an aircraft carrier, they counter with this, you counter with that. You know what the name of the littoral combat ship is? The nickname in the US military? The little crappy ship. Because it's such a corruption disaster. These things suck, they can't make them, it takes years to make one, they're ineffective. The US military's own games show they just get blown up by the Iranian military. They're not effective at the role they were supposed to play. Now, the US spent a huge amount of money developing this ship. It was supposed to be the way to defeat Iran after the defeat of the Millennium Challenge. Although people didn't say that because you're not supposed to say that. But it failed. So all this, again, is just to say the gap closed. So the US is in a bit of a pickle here. Oh, I have a duplicate. Sorry. Okay, just to emphasize again, they took it down. So fast forward 20 years. Shortly after the Ukraine war began, Real Clear Defense and other Pentagon-aligned publications were publishing warnings for years now, not about war with Iran, but about the problems in US supply chains. US military supply chains, after decades of neoliberalism, cannot reasonably produce anything approaching the requisite munitions to fight a great power, and maybe even a regional power. The US realized this very clearly in Ukraine. They very quickly ran out of munitions, not just drones, not just missiles, but especially artillery shells. They couldn't make artillery shells fast enough, and they really still can't. There was various efforts undertaken by the military and the various defense contractors and the US government overall to begin to address this, to ameliorate the problem. They have not succeeded. Actually, things are so bad that a few years later, the Pentagon had to halt some promised munitions for Ukraine because they'd already depleted reserves all around the world, not just for Ukraine, and they had to resupply the US bases around the world to have enough munitions. They couldn't keep just funneling things into Ukraine. And so right before this war, one of Trump's generals leaked to the press, the top general, Dan Raisin Kane, as Trump always likes to emphasize in his tweets or whatever Truth Socials posts about them, that he leaked that the US does not have the munitions to fight this war, don't have the missiles, don't have the interceptors, can't do it. And let's look at the Pentagon's byline. Because, okay, the US, according to the US, has already shot 1,000+ missiles, Tomahawk missiles. It's a question, do they actually even have 1,000 of the ships? Estimates, given the fleet they have there, they realistically could have had, if they had no air defense on the fleet, 1,400 Tomahawk missiles on the fleet, roughly. As submarines, maybe 1,600. That's if they have no air defense missiles on the fleet. I don't believe you do that because that means your ships just get shot. So let's say they shot 1,000 of them. Okay. Anyone want to guess ballpark for how many Tomahawk missiles the US plans to produce in 2026? 57. It's not a joke. They still get to 1,000 eventually, 1,000 a year eventually. 57 Tomahawks. They've already shot that many. According to them, they've shot more.
1.3 million each?
And that's just the missile itself. That's not the cost of operating the ship and everything else, the GPS system. 1.3 million each. How much do the Shahed drones cost again? Oh yeah, $10,000. So the US military has a major fucking problem. Actually, Rubio said this the other day, and then he backtracked and said he didn't say it. They make 6 or 7 missiles a day. Or a month, sorry. 6 or 7 a month. Now, how are they gonna solve this? The US has lots of money. What do you throw money at the problem? How do you turn quantity into quality? Anyone read Capital? It's a little more complicated, right? It doesn't just magically become quality. The problem the US ruling class has had is a lot of them, and this is kind of a problem arising from the overall status that many of them has as rentiers, as people who just collect interest on their existing capital that their family owns for generation. They don't deal with the production side so much. They pay other people to deal with that. And they pay those people based on, McKinsey consulting and private equity things to cut costs, maximize profit. Return on investment. You can game that. But what if you got to have deliverables, like products, like missiles, air defense systems, etc., that work? Well, the problem is a lot of the US economy, through decades of neoliberalism, which they have largely started to abandon now, and maybe mostly abandoned, has basically been hollowed out. I don't just mean offshoring jobs. I mean the overall know-how of how to run an economy, of how to deal with the complex intricacies of production. A lot of that's been lost, actually, in the US manufacturing base. Not the machinery per se, but the understanding of how to coordinate production at a national level. And the US dismantled the state mechanisms. We wrote a paper about this, talking about the shift away from neoliberalism that was published shortly before the 2024 election. It's a long paper, but it deals with some of these things. But guys, don't worry. Trump said, we can fight this war forever. Now, I want to say what a crazy statement this is. I mean, it's crazy in a lot of things because the numbers are public. And even if you think the US has a bunch of secret military reserves they're lying about, the numbers are public. Anyone can do the math. It's not hard. But also, Trump ran on an anti-war ticket. He said, we're going against all the warmongers and the deep state and the fascists and the communists and the neocons who drag us into all these wars. And, Pete Hegseth went on Sean Ryan and other podcasts. He's like, I'm a recovering neocon. That was crazy, all those wars. Trump's base was sold in this election, not totally unreasonably, that Joe Biden was pushing us towards World War III with Russia, and then obviously very unreasonably that Trump was the solution. And the MAGA movement was already fractured. We had a whole event on this after the assassination of Charlie Kirk, who came out against the war in Iran and then kind of kowtowed a little bit. They were already fractured on this question. People were very angry, very, very angry about foreign wars. And now Trump's promising a forever war. How do you think that affects his domestic approval? Which is a calculus. It's not the only factor, but it's a calculus for the ruling class. So this is a crazy message on a lot of levels, even for Trump, who loves writing crazy messages. Now, this is him saying, actually, we're fine, Raising Cane's going to fight this war, etc. We'll get to we can fight for forever in a minute. Let's remember the poop problem. Has anyone read Gravity's Rainbow by Thomas Pynchon? It's a fantastic book. Gravity's Rainbow refers to the missile arc, and Pynchon is a really incredible writer. It's about the end of World War II and the establishment of the potential for a missile war after World War II. One of the things he talks about as a joke is the idea after the Nazis had an incident where they had to deal with some poop on a submarine that got blown up, that they were going to develop a bunch of toilet ships to stop the poop problem. And it's a big, funny joke in the middle of the book. And the joke is that actually the Nazis only built one of these, but they were going to build 1 million toilet ships, and all the sailors could go on those ships, and they're especially equipped for poop, and then you'd never have any toilet problems again on ships. It's like literally true now with the fucking, the USS Gerald Ford, the most advanced and best aircraft carrier in the world, supposedly, the best of the US fleet, clogged full of shit. And supposedly the sailors, to protest after being stuck out off the coast of Venezuela, blowing up random fishermen for months, 6 months, which is supposed to be the end of their deployment, extended to 8 months, are then being sent across the world. What do? They start taking their uniforms and towels, anything they can get, and flushing it down the toilet to make the poop worse. Not because they want to live in a shit, but because they don't want to fight a war. And they don't want to be fucking stuck for another 12 months or whatever, endless deployment. So you have no missiles, you've got your own assessment says you can't win, you've got no clear real war objectives, you totally misunderestimated the enemy, and now your own sailors are mutinying before the war even starts. And as we'll find out, the US also can't defend its own bases. And then, right before this whole thing happened, remember all those protests in Iran? Now, some of those protests, just to be clear, there was some genuine protests that started. People were facing real price hikes. Very quickly, Mossad activated a series of sleeper cells who were armed and started shooting people, burning, causing total chaos. Handala, which was just banned from Twitter yesterday, Iranian state hacker group, hacked. They revealed hacked into the Israeli security. They revealed a few things. A bunch of stuff was very interesting. First, they revealed the commanding officer guiding these riots and the coordination between the Israeli state and Mossad and the riots that were playing out. Again, there was real genuine protest and those were co-opted. And then very quickly, the popular sentiment turned against people burning down mosques and hospitals and shooting people in the streets. This is a hack of Sapir. Now, I want to be clear how crazy it is that Israel still wanted the war after this was hacked. Sapir is supposed to be this untouchable, vacuum-sealed defense coordination thing in Israel. That's like the layer that coordinates between Mossad and the IDF and the internal security in Israel and keeps it all airtight. And it's, everything's air-gapped and so on and so forth. Here's the guy who runs it. Not publicly known that he ran it. Here's his photos of him, selfies with his family on the beach, him with his wife, everything. They had it all. They published it all. This group has gone on to hack the Israeli National Defense Security Services. I forget what's it called. It's the big think tank is integrated with Mossad. I forget the name of it. It's NDSS, but I'm forgetting it. They hacked Saudi Aramco yesterday. They've hacked like 15 different things across the Gulf to show what they can do. And now they're banned from X, so we don't even know what they're packing. But this is a slap in the face to the Israeli intelligence, who was supposedly so superior and could find anyone in the world and kill anyone anytime and has the Where's Daddy app. For those who don't know, Where's Daddy is an application that Mossad developed that specifically aims to assassinate people when they're at home with their family. and is very effective. So it basically is meant to say, oh, if you're an enemy of Israel, we'll slaughter you with your kids. No one's safe. This is the Iranian state laughing in their faces and publicly shaming them and saying, look, we've penetrated the highest level. For those who didn't see, a key person in the war cabinet was an Iranian sleeper. That was revealed this past fall when he got caught. He'd been there for a long time. You can see photos with him with all the top Israeli officials. So Iran had penetrated deep, deep, deep into Israel's intelligence services, and they still went ahead with this war. And here's a little analysis of the breach. You can see, I took this screenshot today. This post is now unavailable. It's taken down, their whole Honda, and they put up like 5 different accounts. They all keep getting banned. And this is just a little bit of explanation of it. You can read it. I'm not going to read it out loud. His phone was hacked in the meetings he was in, the general who runs this. It gives you a sense of just how significant this is. And then, of course, right before the war is about to start, as if things weren't already bad enough for the U.S. ruling class, we have the Huckabee interview that we just talked about, which is, maybe the most disastrous U.S. politician, diplomat interview ever. And I talked about it a little bit, but Huckabee basically said, yeah, Israel has the right, because of the Bible, to the whole fucking region. And he couldn't talk clearly about the Bible. He couldn't talk about any policy. He didn't know anything about the whole region. The man is an idiot. We kind of knew that. He also, for those who didn't know, he famously helped to get a Israeli spy who was a convicted pedophile in the U.S. who had abused a bunch of children out to Israel. And so Tucker asked him about this in an interview, kind of a hot topic given all the Epstein stuff and the Epstein's ties to Mossad. And Huckabee lied through his teeth about this and played dumb and pretended he was trying to clear the air, and Tucker eviscerated him on that too. But this interview was so controversial and so insane that right before the war, a huge number of countries allied with the U.S. came together and issued a joint statement against Huckabee. Which, now, many of these countries have U.S. bases. They're supposedly, and to some degree, they are helping the U.S. in this war. But the diplomatic fallout of this thing created major, major problems domestically in these countries and created major rifts in their ruling class. It's one thing, to be a comprador for the U.S. in Dubai. You've got your money to play around with. You can go and torture people in Afghanistan, like that one sheikh who was the Epstein files. He personally tortured people and sent the torture video to Epstein. You can go and invest in plundering Africa a bit. You can hang out with celebrities like Andrew Tate and Ian Miles Chung, who admitted 2 days ago that he was the Reddit co-moderator with Ghislaine Maxwell. For those who don't know, Ghislaine Maxwell was the first Redditor to reach 1 million karma. And she moderated World News and r/politics and everything. And Ian Miles Chung, who's like Dubai, he was from Indonesia, but he's like in Dubai, he's there. So anyways, these people suck, is what I'm saying. So, but the UAE ruling class, it's one thing to get that and, financing crypto people come there. It's another thing to basically be told that you're only in charge for now, and when the time comes, Israel's taking your land too. And since Israel, bombed Hamas delegates who were in Qatar at the behest of the U.S. and of Israel, they bombed Qatar. There's been a series of diplomatic fallouts. These countries, the ruling classes in them, are looking at Israel thinking, if they want to just fuck with us, is anyone going to stop them? Can we really? Do we really want to be U.S. puppets? Wouldn't it be better to have a little more independence, or not stand up a little more to Israel? Maybe, get some money from Russia and China, shift gears a little bit. Some of them have been kind of putting out feelers in that regard anyways. Now, they're not about to suddenly all go against the U.S., but that's real debate that happens. Their policies do shift accordingly. So why go to war? Why go to war after all this? With all this insanity happening, with one diplomatic fuck-up after another, with your own assessment saying it doesn't make sense, etc. Why go to war? So there's a series of huge crises engulfing the empire. The Ukraine war is one such crisis. The U.S., for those who don't know, the Biden administration expected that by provoking Russia into invading Ukraine, which doesn't justify Russia's invasion, I'm not trying to do that, but the Biden administration did provoke them, undeniably. The U.S. ruling class provoked them. They thought they were going to win in a year. Jake Sullivan, the brains, if you can call him that, behind the Biden administration, planned in Davos in the desert, this big summit, it's not called really Davos in the desert, that's its nickname, in Saudi Arabia, to have it be a celebration of US victory over Russia. They thought Russia was going to collapse, they were going to partition Russia. It was going to be a new American century. How'd that work out? They are facing crises domestically. It's fairly obvious. Crisis of legitimacy of both parties. Trump was sort of got some popularity boost, but then he himself is actually now tanking. He's the most unpopular president ever. Before the election, especially after the assassination attempts, it seemed like he was really the golden in terms of his mandate. And within a year, he's totally fucked that up. There's waning power globally. The US ruling class is having to accept a smaller share of the pie, both from rival imperialist powers like Russia and China, but also the Europeans are trying to get some strategic autonomy. And there's a series of US countries that are oppressed by the US who are asking for a bit more here or there. There's also cyclical crises in the capitalist system, and there's a lot of debate about actually the nature of those, but my argument is that we're not only approaching the end of the last 10-year cycle, and there's been every 10 years since the first capitalist crisis, roughly every 10 years, since 1827, another economic crisis. And we're getting there. The last one was really in 2019, right before COVID, and then that was kind of padded by all the COVID funding. And so there's some real overheating of the economy and some real problems, and we can talk more about that. There's also 50-year cycles, and we're in a pretty intense bust-oriented one since 2008, a real economic trough where things are not really recovered to pre-2008 levels. And there's more to be said about that, but it's a major problem the capitalists face. There's domestic instability. As I noted, they hoped to rally people to the flag. They thought people would rally behind Bovino and Stephen Miller's like crypto-fash or openly fascist and white nationalist politics. That didn't really happen so much. They killed some white people. Turns out the MAGA base wasn't so happy about that. There's the real factor of distracting from the Epstein files. That's not irrelevant. It's a big factor. The US ruling class has had just a small portion of those files out, and they reveal really horrifying stuff. But they also reveal a lot of how the US ruling class works. And no matter how much they try to spin some of that in terms of, oh, it's just about Jesus versus Satan or whatever, they're worried about the impact of this stuff and what it shows about how the US empire works, one administration to the next. There's also, as I noted, the arrogance and hubris. This is not just a matter of individuals, but it's baked into the very system itself. The imperialists and their disdain for the people means they generally underestimate mass popular movements and whole countries and their ability to resist. They're thinking, I wouldn't fight to the death for anything. How could the Iranian people fight to the death? Well, it turns out some people aren't just motivated by immediate personal gain and greed and can think beyond themselves. It's surprising. There's obviously the structurally baked in subjectivity and decision making, which I already spoke about. And then there's the Israeli pressure. I want to be clear, Bibi personally wants this war, but he also needs this war. Before October 7th, Israel was rocked by a series of crises over and over and over again. And there was a bunch of elections and failures to form a government because they have a parliamentary system. And October 7th provided Bibi with cover to maintain his government, to maintain his position, but also he's under investigation for a whole bunch of corruption. There was huge mass protests against him. And if he's kicked out of office, he could face jail for life. He's worried about that. And even recently, there was a court proceeding against him. And then in the middle of that court proceeding, they launched offensive operations in Syria, so the court proceeding had to stop. So he personally actually has a strong incentive to have another war go on to keep him in power and not in jail. And that's not the only factor. I've put Israeli pressure on the bottom here. Not to say it's the least important, but I don't believe analyses that say this is the most important factor, actually. I think it's overstated in a certain section of the left to say this is just about Israel running the US. And that leads to some dangerous territory of the idea that Israel occupies the US or so on and so forth. It's just not an accurate assessment. The Israeli politicians were basically joined at the hip from the Israeli ruling class to the US. They do exert a pretty powerful influence right now in the US. But if you really think the problem is Israel's occupied by the US, then politicians or political figures like Tucker Carlson become a lot more appealing. And that's very dangerous. So a section of right-wing populism could certainly tolerate a good deal of criticism of Israel. Okay, so let's talk the war proper. For those who watched the little briefing this morning from Pete Hegseth, you may have noticed this lovely map. What does this map look like? US winning. Look at how big those US strikes are. They're huge, red and yellow. And then look at the tiny little strikes from Iran. I mean, we're winning, guys. Like, the map shows it. Okay, there's a few problems with the map, but let's talk first. Okay, the war starts, they kill Khomeini. Now, where was Khomeini? I said it already. He was in his house. He's 86 years old. He was in his house. He didn't go under a bunker. He said, look, if 90 million Iranians can't go into a bunker, they can't be protected, I won't. He knew he was going to be martyred and knew the effect that would have. Now, maybe you could say it's a cynical political calculus. I don't know. But he also wasn't afraid of death and thought it made sense to rumors he had cancer maybe, I don't know. But he said he'd rather die fighting than die from cancer or anything else. He said that a few years ago. Again, I don't know if he actually had cancer, but okay, so they kill him. And then Trump immediately expected, we'll negotiate. We'll find someone who's not religious, they'll take over, Delcy Rodriguez, they'll be afraid. Okay, so what's wrong with this map? There's been no strikes on Israel? I mean, there's a lot wrong with this map, but there's been no strikes on Israel? Really? Because if you look at the Israeli evacuation warnings, this is from a few days ago in Tel Aviv. This is one. These are coming out every few hours, all day long. Here's one around Jerusalem. Here's the whole fucking country in one. And there's a lot like this. And there's some photos that have gone through censorship. This one's pretty nondescript, but it's around Jerusalem. One hit there. Some of the destruction in Tel Aviv. These are all from the first day of the war. Here's some of what Tel Aviv looks like after the first day of the war. Right now, there's a few videos that I saw. The videos, I include them, embedded in this presentation was a pain. It's pretty insane what Tel Aviv looks like. And basically, as soon as a new video or photo of Tel Aviv goes up, it's taken down on social media because of the censorship. But to give a sense of that censorship, 2 days ago, CNN was arrested for filming, and a bunch of other news stations were just filming. There was just a strike, they were filming, and they're arrested in Israel. Even major corporate news outlets can't film. The ones that are promoting pro-Israeli talking points can't film. And that's how bad it is right now. And we have lovely Mike Huckabee. Once again, this is just note to Americans. It's actually funny further down. He has a list of all the things you can do to evacuate, and every single list article is numbered 1, which is like a surefire sign that ChatGPT typically does this when you ask it to make a list. So he wrote this with AI, but you can see Ben Gurion Airport's closed because of missile strikes. Now, I want to be clear, even if military planes aren't destroyed in a strike on an airport or an airbase, if the runway's ruined, you can't take off. The only planes that can take off are vertical takeoff. Of the Israeli military, there's not so many vertical takeoffs. In particular, the F-35s that the Israelis have, which are the most advanced variant, the most advanced planes they have, only a very small number of the F-35C, which is the vertical takeoff or jump jet variant. So with the Israeli airports being destroyed, that seriously impacts the ability of the Israelis to maintain air superiority, which is essential as the war escalates. And given all the destruction that we're about to see in a minute of the radar system, these are what the Israeli warning signs about missile and drone strikes look like now. What you'll notice is there's no longer specific spots. The images I showed you earlier are not of the strikes, it's where they expect the strikes to potentially hit. These are warnings in Israel. They no longer can say, because the radar systems are so damaged, exactly where it's going to be. They said this whole area. Look at that. That's from Hebron all the way up. It's everything. So these are what the warnings they're putting out now look like. So these radar systems. This is the most advanced radar system the US has in the Middle East. Sorry, had. It's in Qatar. It's there as part of an integrated system of a whole bunch of radars to help the US monitor everything, communications, etc., but especially for fighting in the air and for missiles and drones. In the first hours of the war, it was hit. This is the AN/FPS 132. You can see right there on the northern face, it was hit. It was confirmed by multiple satellite images after Iran initially said it was hit. Actually, you can see videos of it being hit. A very slow flying drone flies into it at about 50 miles an hour and hits it, showing how much the air defenses failed in the first hours of the war. This radar, at the time it was created, cost $1.1 billion. I'm sure it's more expensive now when the new price increases coming to everything because of this war. It'll be only more expensive. It also requires time and safety to produce one of these things. You can't just make one overnight. It takes probably 6 months or something to make it. It got hit once, and then Iran hit it again, and now it's totally destroyed. They hit it again today. This is the most advanced radar. It forms a web of other radar systems, so let's look at some other ones. Here's one of the ones in Bahrain, at the 5th Naval Fleet. The two that are there are destroyed. Just to give you a sense, gone. What is this? Anyone know? It's not HIMARS. It's a THAAD, Terminal High Altitude Area Defense. How many of these are there in the world?
14.
Before the war started, there were 14. There are now 10. In the first 5 days of the war, the Iranians have destroyed 10. Destroyed 4. The last, as far as we know, there might be one more in Saudi, but the last one is in Israel. There may be one in Saudi too. The US is planning to maybe move some from around the world. The THAADs, in order to make them, they take a while to make. In order to make them, you need gallium. What is gallium? It's a rare earth metal for which China has a virtual monopoly. It's a rare earth metal that China just so happens to not be selling to the United States right now. Which means you don't make any more THAADs. This is the qualitative problems the US, one of many examples of qualitative problems the US faces. THAADs are mobile. They're extremely advanced. They're gone. They're gone probably for good, the ones that are destroyed. They may move some, as I'll show you in a second, from South Korea. And what'll happen to that one? It'll be gone too. The US air defense system is collapsing. This is not trivial. This is not minor damage. This is not some suicide bomber or some protest outside the green zone. This is destruction of the very fundamental infrastructure necessary for the US to fight wars. 500 million to $1 billion per unit. Here's Kim.com, a fairly reliable source of information on this particular topic, which is kind of crazy that he is. The guy who made Mega Upload and now Mega, he's sort of an absurd person, but he is like very gleefully watching the US empire crumble. He breaks down here all of the destruction of the US radar stuff that's happened. This is sent out not so long ago. Most not so long ago. It's pretty insane. This means the whole US military command and control decision-making structure is operating largely blind. It also means their ability to intercept missiles and drones is collapsing in real time, and Iran hasn't even begun to really bring out the big weapons. This is from a Russian site, just showing some of the destruction that was collected. So you see the ones in UAE and Jordan destroyed, and the ANFPS 132 in Qatar. This doesn't even include some of the other stuff that I showed you earlier, where they just have nice satellite images. And you can see here, the reason I included it is you have a map here. So the THAADs cover this range, but you can see the radar that was in Qatar is massive, massive radar that actually extends all the way over Europe and Russia. So it's incredibly important for not just US regional dominance, but for global dominance. And it's been essential to the US's fighting, proxy fighting against Russia and Ukraine. So the reverberations from this conflict, maybe you're now beginning to get a sense of the global implications. The US may move THAADs from South Korea. When the THAADs were placed in South Korea during the increased tensions during the US-China trade war in the first Trump administration, there was mass protests against them. People were furious. They're like, how dare you put these in our country? This is going to be a way that you can defend us. I thought systems were for defense. No, they're for offense. They allow you to, or the theory is, they allow you to hit an enemy without being hit back yourself. Not working out so well for the US military now. Okay, let's look in contrast. What is this? This is the launching system, one of many, for the Shahed drones, of which the Iranian government again has 80,000. What is that? That's a nondescript box truck, which if you move the cover over, is indistinguishable from any other truck on the road. Do you think the US has the bombs to explode every single box truck in Iran? A country of, what was it, 92 million people? No. You know, these, the great thing about the Shaheds, you don't need a big fancy system to launch them, unlike the HIMARS, for example, which you mentioned, which you need a huge system to launch from and it takes forever to make and so on. You can launch them from a Toyota Tundra. And Iran's ballistic missiles are similar. They're truck mounted, they can be put on a box truck, indistinguishable from a satellite, from any other truck, and launched. So the US has a major problem. They can't locate the launches. And so what are they hitting? Decoys. Iran has a bunch of decoys. Decoy drones. These drones here don't even match the geometry of the Shahed. The US CENTCOM videos look, we blow up drones. First of all, watch those videos. And you've never played Call of Duty or any of those games, you do drone strikes in some of the Call of Duty games. And what happens when you blow up a missile? It blows up. Look for secondary explosions. That is, you hit something, the missile, the bomb that you hit it with blows up, and then there's a bigger explosion. Watch the CENTCOM videos. How many of those was a secondary explosion? Basically none, which means they hit decoys. Either already spent launchers or fucking wooden or plastic decoys. Or, like the Israelis, they hit a painting. So you can't tell so well in this video, but they hit this helicopter. The IDF posted this. And then you see after the bomb hit, the helicopter's still there because it's a fucking painting. And the US said they hit a bunch of F-14s, and they were also paintings on the ground. And they post these videos, the idiots at CENTCOM. So you know if that's the videos they have, they're sharing of owning the Iranians, the war's going pretty fucking bad for them. This is some statistics I already said. This was posted by the PLA, the Chinese PLA, again emphasizing the close integration or support that China has offered to Iran. But yeah, look at the numbers. And again, they're in box trucks. You can just have one in a garage, throw it on a Toyota, drive it somewhere and launch it in a matter of minutes. And then drive that Toyota away. And then by the time the US, if they even still can with their radar systems destroyed, detects where you launch it from, you're gone. This was a major challenge that Israel faced in their 2006 invasion of Lebanon, is the Lebanese were able to launch a rocket and then pack their, like Hezbollah was able to launch a rocket, pack up and move in like a minute. And it took the Israelis a few minutes to figure out where they launched from. And that was in close combat, you know, just a few miles across the border. And it took them a minute or two to figure out and hit back with artillery. And so Hezbollah perfected the ability of hit, pack up, go. This is, you know, you can launch these from deep in a country. The US has no clue where they're coming from. And again, let's just look at that statistic again. How many Tomahawks a year to hit these drones? Oh yeah, 57. 57 a year. They said they've launched 2,000 strikes. They said they launched 1,000 Tomahawks. Okay, let's take it seriously. They're out. And even if they're not out, where do they get more Tomahawks from? Oh yeah, their bases. We'll get to that in a second. So Rubio let out the cat out of the bag. I already said this, but in his press conference yesterday, he said, oh, it's 6 to 7 interceptors a month and a similar number of missiles per month. Iran makes 100 missiles and thousands of suicide drones a month. Overall drones, not just the Shaheds. Shaheds about 400 a month. Overall drones over 1,000 a month, maybe thousands a month right now. The US does not have the fighting capacity. I hope I've driven this home at this point by going through a bunch of sources and saying it over and over and over again. The US ruling class is saying it themselves. Then they're denying they say it, but they say it. They're fucked. The longer this goes on, the more depleted the US air defense becomes, the more free reign Iran has. Here's a nice little infographic about the problem. There's the economic and production problems. You can look at it. It's just reiterating some of the basics of what I've said about them possibly moving things around, monthly production discrepancies, and so on. And yeah, there's not a way to solve this problem in a 2-week or 2-month, and maybe at the pace the US is moving 2-year timeline. 2 years would be extremely fast for them. And given how the war is playing out and the decimation, now the Gulf states are running out of missile interceptors, if they're not already out. Now you can't really trust their self-reported numbers. They may be inflating how many drones they've shot down, but if they're even close to what they're saying in terms of how many missile interceptors they fired, they're out. And a bunch of press have reported that they're all saying they're out and demanding reloads from the US. You can also just look at the videos, even though they're being suppressed, how many drones are getting through without a single missile fire. Now, that could be a radar failure, but more often than not, that's a calculus. Do we waste our interceptors, of which we're running out, on a drone, or do we save them for a bigger missile? That's the sort of calculus the Gulf states are evidently making right now. And the US is making, and Israel's making. But don't worry, guys. This is the one I started talking about before, mistakenly. Trump says there's plenty of missiles, we can fight forever. Now, what he says is interesting. He says they're elsewhere. And he's not totally wrong about that, because the US military has a system called lily pads. Lily pads are an innovation the US military developed. I guess they technically are an innovation. In the 2000s, during the War on Terror, as it was called, to basically set up a whole bunch of not just US military bases, but smaller little pads where they pre-positioned a huge amount of munitions. Ammo, food, rations, bombs, interceptors, etc. And this system is integral to how the US military logistics works. Anyone who works in logistics will tell you, if you go to a logistics school, get a master's in logistics engineering, the Pentagon will come. And they'll beg you to come and work on military logistics. Because military logistics are a mess. And they kind of always want to solve it, but there's all this inertia, they can't really figure it out. I'm sure people have heard some of the stories during Iraq 2 of them dumping 20,000 water bottles in the middle of the desert, thinking someone was supposed to deploy there, then they didn't. Big benefit to Poland Spring, but no one drank that water, it just rotted in the desert. And there's a million stories like that. But these lily pads, as much of a mess as the US military logistics are, and that's not a problem they can just throw money at and solve, it's a qualitative problem that requires serious structural adjustments, which they're not capable of doing. These lily pads are integral to how the US repositions, manned supplies, different theaters, and so on. So what did Iran do? Anyone want to guess? They hit all the lily pads in the bases in the first day of the war. Those are some of their first targets. So Trump is telling us this here, actually, because they're supposed to have extra interceptors in the Middle East. They're gone. They got blown up. Robert Gates was Secretary of Defense under Bush and then under Obama for a little while. He has a memoir called Duty. It's worth reading. It's Perspective of an Imperialist. He has a chapter, extremely interesting chapter in his book called Waging War Against the Pentagon, where he talks about his years-long battle against the inertia of the Pentagon to simply get basic armor on the Humvees so roadside bombs wouldn't kill the soldiers in them. And he said he had to fight a war against the whole Pentagon. As the Secretary of Defense, with the support of the presidents, just to get armor. Could you imagine the problems to coordinate a global production of more missiles? So the lily pads are gone in the Middle East. So you feed all the bombs into the wood chipper, all the tomahawks, all the interceptors from around the world. What is the impact of that? You could do it, and then hope in 2 years you get Pentagon stuff sorted out and you have more tomahawks. What do you think happens to the US military if they pull all their tomahawks and interceptors from the Pacific, from Europe? It opens up a whole bunch of opportunities for other powers and other great powers, Russia and China and other imperialist powers, to make some advances. It also means a whole bunch of regional powers and small countries that are overall oppressed by imperialism start to say, you don't have the fucking bombs to tell us what to do anymore, you just wasted them all, and we saw you lose that war. So their option really is to potentially cannibalize the existing US military logistics to try to fight this war. That's the one option they have in the short term for the next months or years. And that's a pretty insane option that Trump is openly saying he's going to do. Now, will the Pentagon let him do it? I don't know. But that's what he's saying he's going to do, and that's what Hegseth's saying they're doing. And they seem to want to double and triple down on every loss here. Okay, so this is out of date because it's from yesterday. But these are the strikes on US bases. You can see these are the US bases in the area, and there's a few up in Syria, various it says, but basically everyone was hit. No, Djibouti wasn't hit. But as soon as the US carriers go there to reload, because they need to reload in port and not at sea, Who do you think starts hitting them? The Houthis, exactly. So just to be clear, the US military does not presently have the capacity to reload missiles or air defense systems in their ships, carriers, battleships, etc. at sea. This was technology they were developing in the Cold War, but when the Cold War ended, they abandoned it, as they did many initiatives. Believe me, they don't need to fight that. They'll always be fighting weaker enemies and never fight anyone who can go toe-to-toe with them. A few years ago, they started to rebuild that, and I'll talk about that in a second, but it's nowhere near ready. So they have to go to a base to reload. The ships have not docked. They can't go anywhere in the Gulf. Those bases are gone. They're literally gone, those military bases. I'm not being hyperbolic. The satellite imagery has been confirmed. Those bases are gone. So they have to go either to India, where they just got hit off the coast of India by Iran, or to Djibouti, or somewhere else. To the Mediterranean, they can't go to Cyprus.
Diego Garcia, maybe.
Yeah, Diego Garcia, that's potentially the option. It's insane. Okay. I mentioned this a few times, but I want to emphasize how crazy this is. Instead of housing the key troops, they have normal troops at the base, but they took the officers off the bases. They thought the bases might get hit when they hit Iran, so they stored them in hotels. Iran knew exactly where they were, at least a good deal of them. They hit a bunch of high-level US military officers and CIA agents who were meeting in hotels. The level of signal intelligence and human intelligence that Iran therefore has in these Gulf states is stunning. After this happened, what did the US military do? They issued a memo to all troops stationed in the Middle East. They said, be extremely cautious with your cell phone and remove these apps which have been compromised. Just some obscure apps like Uber and Snapchat that had been compromised either by the Iranians or by Chinese intelligence that then fed them to the Iranians, the data. So according to the US military even, the Iranians had been able to successfully use electronic surveillance to track the movements of high-level US military officers and kill them. Pretty significant. Here's one of many Iranian strikes that have targeted some key infrastructure in the Gulf. Now, to be clear, there's been some false flags too, where Israel targeted some countries, but I believe this one is real. That is, it wasn't Israel or the US that did it, trying to push these countries into the war. I'll talk about that in a minute. But Iran struck a power station for the largest desalination plant in the UAE, which means there's not even much water in the UAE. I don't know if people saw the videos, but all across the Gulf, as soon as this war broke up, there was an emptying of every single supermarket. Water, food, everything. Not clothes and luxury goods, obviously. But yeah, it's going to be crazy, and they understand that. And the impacts domestically in those countries is going to be very intense because a lot of the monarchies are not very popular. For example, in Bahrain during the Arab Spring, there was almost a revolution when the majority Shia population, who was oppressed under this dynasty backed by the Saudis, revolted, and they were put down. And now they're taking to the streets again, and the government in Bahrain may well fall. And the US military can't really support them. They've in fact retreated from Bahrain by and large. The US left their supposedly unsinkable aircraft carrier and fled into Saudi Arabia. And as they were fleeing, they made the decision to flee. What did Iran do? Within minutes, got intel on that and hit them as they were crossing the one bridge that connects Bahrain to Saudi Arabia. In every single front of this war, the US is being outmaneuvered. And so what's the response from the Gulf states? Ban Twitter accounts. Don't let the information get out, and don't let people look at the information. If you just deny what's happening all around them, they'll you can control the narrative in peacetime. Do you really think you can convince people, well, the bombs are falling and your economy's collapsing and your stock market's tanking, and there's no food, and maybe no water, and all the ports are closed and you can't fly out, and there's a 12-hour queue to get even to Oman, a 12-hour traffic jam right now between UAE and Oman? Do you really think you can convince the people that everything's good by blocking some Twitter accounts? Here's a graphic I found. Ignore the one typo, I didn't make it. Foreign. Dubai is over. This is not an exaggeration. What's the deal in Dubai? You're safe from geopolitics in Dubai. Lower tax rates. You can be a sex trafficker like Andrew Tate and go there and no one cares. People even like you because it's a disturbing, fucked up place. That's done. I mean, maybe they'll be still fine welcoming Andrew Tate, probably. He's going there right now and live streaming it because he's a psychopath. I'm not joking about that. He said all him and his warrior buddies are heading there. It's like literally, like, he's a caricature. You know, hotels are burning. Hotels were hit. The Burj Al Arab was hit. A bunch of other hotels were hit. Targeted specifically, especially some of Trump's big investments were targeted there. The airport's hit and inoperable. The real estate bubble's bursting. The stock market's crashing. There's no go to Dubai and live a luxury lifestyle and don't worry about the world and, you know, invest in crypto and not pay taxes. That's done. And Dubai's whole thing as a center of finance is likely over. It's stunning because Dubai has been a sort of international symbol of the decadence of the imperialist system and of the corrupt Arab governments. And in a few days, it's been functionally destroyed. Now, the exact fallout that will follow from this will take some time, but I think it's not an exaggeration to say it's over. The capital flight, which is already ongoing, is massive, and it will only accelerate in the coming weeks. And there's no chance of any shipping any oil. There's no chance of refining the oil or the gas, and all the downstream stuff, the polymers, the aluminum, and everything else that they use to make from some of the stuff is also all done. In fact, huge companies throughout the Gulf have declared force majeure, meaning they can't be legally obligated to meet their contracts because of events outside of their control, namely the war. And so, given how bad the war is going, this is the US and Israel's plan. The Israeli defense minister, Katz, has openly said they're going to use tornado strategy. What is the tornado strategy? Mass civilian casualties, hit high-profile targets, carpet bomb Tehran, hit symbolic places, destroy historic places. Shock and awe to the next level, really. And that's what the US military and Hegseth have been saying too. So you can't beat them militarily. What do? Slaughter the population and hope that works, which it won't, to be frank. It will actually help to rally the entire population behind the government, especially who are already feeling that. Set aside your grievances for the time being, at least, to fight against foreign invasion. I'm not saying that totally makes sense. There's some questions on how you do that. You know, we can see, for example, some of the resistance to the Nazis in the Second World War. The communists shouldn't have tailed, say, Charles de Gaulle. It should have tried to organize someone independently in France and so on. But that's another topic for another day. The point is that this strategy will actually likely strengthen the resolve of the people and rally them behind the government, especially when the fighting capacity of the Iranian government cannot be degraded very easily. The US and Israel now hope to establish air superiority over Iran, meaning they will finally send the F-22s and the other fighters in to fight. That's why the last of the US, or not the last, but the last almost of the US in-air refueling systems are now flying across the Atlantic to reinforce systems there. The F-22s and the F-35s will be sent, and are being right now sent over to Tehran to carry out carpet bombing, which they're already doing. One was shot down today, an F-35 in Iran. More will be shot down soon. And can you imagine the impact globally when the US and Israeli elite jets are shot down over Tehran? Tehran has also shot down a bunch of elite drones and has captured them without basically damaging them because they use complex satellite and GPS interference systems, which can be employed against the jets potentially too. And now they will use those drones, research the latest US technology and Israeli technology, the Hermes in particular, be better equipped to understand it and fight it, and also use whatever innovations are in it against the US and Israel, probably in a matter of months, because that's the rate the Iranian production of drones happens at. The US takes years to do basic adaptations. So while I imagine this will be genocidal, I do not believe this will in any way defeat the Iranian warfighting effort. And that's very important to understand because a lot of times in the US left, what we've seen is the US government and or Israel go in, really fuck up a country, decimate them, do horrible things, and then the country's subjugated. But Iran is not like Iraq. When the US invaded Iraq, what did the Iraqi army do? Surrendered en masse. When the US invaded Afghanistan, well, the people took to the hills and then fought a courageous war of resistance against the US and their pedophile warlords who they backed. And for those who don't know, one of the key things of the Taliban was their fight against the pedophilia that the US-backed warlords from the earlier era had carried out in mass. And okay, the Afghan people eventually won. Iraq is still, for now, under US thumb to some extent, although the US hold on it's been really weakening. And this will be the end of US influence in Iraq, almost certainly. And so, what can we expect from the US and Israel? Well, more things like the first thing they did in the war, which is the war crime of bombing a school, of elementary school, and killing, 163 young girls. And targeting of hospitals, also a war crime. Again, if it's legal to blow up a hospital, okay, whatever, like, that's insane, but it's not. Yeah, and Israel's open about this. They've been targeting specifically the hospitals. The U.S. is openly targeting hospitals. Children's hospitals has been one of their main targets. I think they got like 5 or 6 hospitals yesterday. And they're targeting police stations, hoping that then they can have some unrest and the Iranian security forces won't be able to contain it. Although supposedly, most of the police stations they've hit have been evacuated in advance. In addition to carrying out mass civilian casualties and possibly a genocidal strategy of war aimed at destroying the very means of life and sustenance in Iran, although I don't think they have the missiles and capabilities to do that in a country of 92 million people, at least not without nuking. And Iran can fight back and has proven fairly effective at fighting back. Israel, as reported by Tucker Carlson, Middle East Eye, and elsewhere, has carried out a number of false flag operations. We can talk about the U.S. possible false flags in a minute, but false flag operations in the Gulf countries. They blew up some sections of Saudi Aramco's production. Tucker noted that there was other plans to do this in Qatar and the UAE as well. Iran categorically denied they did this, and there's videos online that say, look, guys, we're in the UAE. Iran's over there. Behind us is not Iran. There's other countries there. If the drones come from there and blow up our facilities, that's not Iran. And those are a bit tongue-in-cheek. But yeah, Israel and the US have been carrying out false flag operations in an attempt to force the Gulf monarchies' hands to enter the war. But they're extremely afraid of doing so. Why? What did the Houthis do a few years ago? They flew a single drone across all of Saudi Arabia and into Aramco. And the damage they did took the Saudis a few weeks to fix. Just one drone. Saudi Arabia has the most centralized oil production facilities in the world, which is advantageous in terms of cost cutting and a few other things, but leaves it extremely vulnerable to drone and missile attacks. The Gulf countries, the monarchies, compradors for US imperialism, they're extremely aware of how vulnerable they are. That if Iran or the Houthis wanted to, their production would be decimated. It would take years to get it back online once the war ends. So they're terrified of entering this thing in a real way, beyond letting US bases be there and giving them some basic support. But Israel wants to force their hand, and they've been fairly open actually about that. And then the US responds, boots on the ground, if necessary. They said that yesterday. And they said, oh, the war's progressing way ahead of schedule. We're doing great, guys, but we might have to send a few American troops on the ground, but things are going really well. This is a real serious consideration of the US ruling class. And this, I don't think, will be the path they choose, but they're discussing and debating it, and they're telling us it. And any sort of boots on the ground, immediately after that, the question becomes draft. Now, again, I don't think that's in the most likely scenario, but that is in the realm of possibility here. So boots on the ground is a real possibility. In the meantime, what the US is doing is arming Kurdish forces. Supposedly they've armed some in Iran. Actually, the Iranian government said they seized some weapons from Kurdish groups yesterday, maybe today actually. Trump called Kurdish groups in Iraq, as I mentioned earlier, talked about arming them. As soon as the phone call ended, and they agreed to be armed by the US, Iran started hitting them with drones and missiles. Now a section of those Kurdish groups say they will not fight, and they will not invade. But let's say they do invade. They go through the mountain passes into Iran. Great. When was the last time someone invaded through those mountain passes? It wasn't some relatively small groups of Kurdish fighters with some air support from the US and Israel. No, it was the Iraqi army in the Iran-Iraq war. And how long did they get bogged down in those mountains for? 8 years. Another great alternative, go through the 1,000-kilometer desert in the southeast of Iran, there's not really an easy option for land invasion here. Fight through the mountains anyway, or the desert. The US, I'm sure, has some contingency planning around this. How can we do a ground invasion? But this is not a well-planned out, thought out military strategy. This is a flailing strategy to desperately call, like, if the US was really gonna do this and thought they're gonna have to invade Iran and so on and so forth, what do? You have everything ready in advance. You plan the uprisings, which Mossad planned earlier to try to force Trump into this war, and then you have the forces storm in right away. Now, 5-6 days, you're starting some half-hearted, poorly planned out, last-minute agreed-to invasion. Like, literally, Trump got on the phone and finally got the deal sorted out to get some of these groups to invade yesterday. Can you imagine how messed up the basic reinforcements, logistics, planning, everything is? And the fact that Iran knew about it and instantly started hitting them means they're ready for the invasion too. Now, of course, there's some mistakes that are going to be made on the Iranian side. They're going to have some subjectivities, some blind spots. But over and over again for the first 5 days of the war, they've anticipated every US maneuver and countered it, or acted before the US could act, more often than not. And so again, if all these options fail, just a reminder of what the US military is talking about. Armageddon. They're seriously working to position the US troops ideologically, prepare them ideologically for a nuclear war. Now, I don't think they literally mean thermonuclear apocalypse of the whole world, although that is in the war planning books. And if you've ever read anything by Daniel Ellsberg, you know that. Or if you ever watched How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Atomic Bomb, Stanley Kubrick film, remember that Ellsberg, who was a nuclear war planner, left that film saying, holy shit, that's a documentary, which should be scary. But I'm talking more what are called tactical nukes. Nukes that are not aimed to destroy a city, and again, that's in the realm of possibility right now with the escalation chain moving the way it is and with the US losing the way it is, but rather tactical nukes to destroy a military installation, or 2 or 10, or blow up a mountain pass, etc. And then there's the Samson option, which I already mentioned earlier, but Seymour Hersh reported on this. It was eventually published in the long book, The Samson Option. It's Israel's plan, if it's ever facing an existential threat, to threaten the entire world with total nuclear apocalypse. And as people may or may not know, shortly before the war, Israel issued an earthquake warning drill, and then right at Dimona, where their nuclear facilities are, had a 4.5 magnitude earthquake. There's no atmospheric nuclear testing anymore, so all of it happens underground, which means they tested a nuke as a message to the world, and as a message to Iran. They're prepared to use nukes. They are, and they're subjective enough and diluted enough to do so. And let's just be clear about the Israeli intents. They refer to the Iranians, and explicitly now, and even CNN is talking about this now, as Amalek, referencing the biblical story, fable, of the slaughter of all 75,000 men, women, and children, and their extermination systematically. Persians, actually, which is pretty open exclamation of religious justification for genocide. They're literally saying we have genocidal intent. They're saying that. Bibi said that in his press conference the other day at the missile site that was the place in Tel Aviv where they were hit. CNN said, oh, hey, look at this. The start of the war coincides with this Purim and the story of Amalek and so on. Like, what the fuck? Yeah, so that's a real possibility. And I don't want to I don't want to fearmonger about it. It's a real possibility. It is within the realm, but I don't think it's the most likely outcome. But you have to mention it in terms of the escalation chain here. But I say that to be realistic about it because actually, hopefully what I've shown here in terms of the total devastation the US is facing should give you some hope. We are seeing the unraveling of the US empire in a meaningful sense, actually. The US empire has totally strategically miscalculated. Their assets are destroyed, their bases are destroyed, their radar is destroyed, and the war is just getting started. And Iran is intensifying the pace of operations now. More advanced hypersonic missiles are being used. Their top-line drones are now coming into play. And the US and Israel and the Gulf countries have basically nothing left in terms of air defense. And what they have, they can't even reliably use as well because of all the destruction of their radar. And this is, for us, something we should be very glad about as people living in the US. This means the power of the empire, which oppresses us and oppresses the people here and around the world, is breaking. Not done, not over by any means, but is breaking in new and profound ways. And given that the US ruling class and the Trump administration in particular does not seem willing to cut their losses, walk away and say, okay, we'll let Iran do their thing, and we have to accept that we're losing. They still believe that they can win, and they're talking about escalating now. It seems that they are likely to only commit to losing more in this war. We'll talk about some of the potential impacts here, but I do not believe the US will be able to maintain a significant military presence in the Middle East after all is said and done here, which is unprecedented in the post-World War II era, and certainly unprecedented since my lifetime, but since the deal was struck with the Saudis in the 70s. This is, 50 plus years of US empire building collapsing before our eyes in real time, being tweeted out, and even with all the censorship they're putting on, we're seeing it. It's frankly incredible. Almost you get a feeling of surrealness. But the impacts of this collapse, empires falling is not an orderly process. We have an extremely unstable situation, a bunch of very, very shaky pillars resting on a foundation full of cracks. When these come tumbling down, a lot happens. And a lot of things that provide openings for hope, but also a lot of chaos and a lot of potential bad things too. So let's talk economic fallout. But before I do, I'll just emphasize one more time. The collapse or breakdown of some parts of the empire that then can open the door for eventually its collapse creates tremendous, tremendous, tremendous openings for popular movements, for the people's movements, and for revolution ultimately. And it gives the working class movement in this country also a tremendous impetus, because people are going to see very, very directly, with prices rising, with having less work, with the economic fallout, that this war is not in their interests. Already, workers at the airports here in New York are having their hours cut. Not just freight, but people cleaning the planes, everything else. Why? No flights to the Middle East. It's right there. Now you've got to go from that basic link, oh hey, your job is cut because of this war, you have fewer hours this week, or maybe you're going to get laid off, to actually the whole problem of bourgeois society. You can't just end at, oh hey, it's not your interest in this war. That's a starting point. But it's a starting point which is so empirically obvious to workers, so as to provide a real opening to clarify to them the need for socialist revolution and the basic anti-imperialist stand that we need to take right now, which is still short of the need for socialist revolution. Okay, let's talk economic fallout. Food and fuel prices are surging. And I do mean surging. UK wholesale gas prices up more than 50%. Across Europe, gas prices went up 50% in the first day of the war, another 30% over the last 2 days, and are set to go higher. And fuel, what do you use that for? Oh yeah, everything. Heating, electricity, producing everything that's produced. That's an input cost for all production, which means prices for everything rise. In food, what is that used for? Oh yeah, feeding everyone. Which means when food gets more expensive, everything else gets more expensive too, because the cost of labor power goes up. This is a little tweet. I think it's a helpful point. For the Gulf itself, food arrives 90% through the Strait of Hormuz. There's a huge sugar refinery that feeds the region. Flour, wheat, everything else, cooking oil. 3 to 6 weeks of inventory, if that. And then if they don't have power, well, less. And then food's very scarce. And in the meantime, what happens is speculation drives food prices through the roof, which is already happening. Which means a lot of things, but it also is a major catalyst for unrest in those countries. Because if people can't afford food, well, what are they going to do? They can't just keep their head down and accept the shitty, terrible conditions they live in, and maybe say, well, at least I can, have a little bit of, time to watch my phone or something. And I'll kind of just zone out. But I can't eat. It creates tremendous, a lot of things. It creates chaos. It fuels unrest, and it creates openings for popular movements. As I already mentioned, even before this, it seems like there may be an end to the monarchy at rate. I don't want to be premature in that, but there's very significant protests and pretty intense clashes with the security forces there. Shipping is totally disrupted. I don't just mean shipping here, like in the immediate war vicinity, which is huge because a huge portion of the world's energy reserves and a whole bunch of the commodities pass through the Strait of Hormuz, but the Red Sea's closed too. Bab el-Mandeb's closed, which means nothing can go through the Suez Canal, which means things have to go around Africa, which means everything gets more expensive. And not just because of the extra fuel costs, but also insurance gets more expensive, and insurance gets a lot more expensive with the chaos of the war. But don't worry, everyone. Trump promised that he'll send US military to defend ships. Guys, how effective was the US military at defending ships when the Houthis were firing at them in the Red Sea? I see people shaking their heads. Yeah, not effective at all. They couldn't do it. It was a failure, their operation to fight the Houthis there. They couldn't defend the ships. And the Iranian military, a bit more significant and powerful than the Houthis. Just like maybe 2 orders of magnitude, that's 100 times more powerful, maybe more. But Trump, who can't even keep US naval ships safe, they fled to India, says he's going to keep shipping safe and escort it through. The cost, what about, where's the interceptors going to come from? Where are the Tomahawk missiles going to come from? I mean, it's literally an absurd and nonsensical statement. And you don't have to believe me about that. Just look at the Financial Times headline. Insurance, 12-fold increase, and that's just getting started. There's no way to backstop trade. Investors know that. They're not, I mean, some investors are real idiots, but people who know the basics of the industry and the insurance companies, like their whole thing is making sure that they accurately calculate the risk. And Trump's promise did nothing to drive down the cost of shipping insurance. There's really nothing the US can do unless they can somehow obtain military supremacy over Iran. Even if they did, as we saw with the Houthis, mobile drone launchers and missile launchers can disrupt shipping for years. And it doesn't seem like there's any viable path to attaining military supremacy over Iran. Production is going to crater. Why? No gas. But also, what do you make with gas and oil? Plastic. And what's plastic in? Well, as we know with microplastics, literally everything. But you also make polymers. You make so many downstream products. And then those raw materials go into everything else, right? So it's not just an input for a water bottle, but it's an input for a little piece in a car. It's an input for a assembly line machinery, which you then use to make other stuff. And so just to give one example, Qatar shut down its natural gas liquefaction. Now, this is very significant because you got to take the gas and turn it to liquid in order to ship it. Otherwise, it's inefficient to ship. And liquefaction, once it's shut down, takes weeks to get back online, at least 2 weeks, if not more. And as Javier Blas, the preeminent reporter at Bloomberg for like energy, oil trade, and everything notes, this is 20% of the world's output of natural gas now offline. That's just Qatar. We're not talking about Iran's shipments that might otherwise flow to the rest of the world through the strait that will have trouble doing so. We're not talking about UAE's shipments. We're not talking about Saudi shipments. We're talking about just Qatar. No, not talking about Kuwait or Bahrain. Okay, so that's insane. 1/5 of the natural gas supply. And remember, already a lot of the Russian natural gas isn't flowing to Europe because of the Ukraine war and the sanctions and everything else. So energy's going to get a lot more expensive. Oil's over $100 a barrel now. It's going to go higher. Natural gas too. And the U.S. can ship some because the U.S. is a net oil and gas exporter now, but they can't make up for 1/5 of the world's supply. And major industries throughout the Gulf, especially aluminum, of which I think 8% of the world's supply comes from the Gulf, are shutting down. And I think it's the smelting there, not necessarily the mining itself. And this is the tip of the iceberg. And everything, again, downstream is impacted by this. But don't worry, it definitely won't affect us here in the US or like in Europe or anything, right? This is a headline from Sweden. Hold cash in case of a war or crisis. That was today. Keep a week's worth of cash on you, the Swedish government says. Sweden's pretty far, last time I checked, from Iran. This is not an indication necessarily that the Swedish economy is about to crumble and not going to pay stuff. But they're saying, look, things are getting very unstable. In order to make sure our citizens don't starve, everyone should hold some cash. And they may be fear-mongering a bit too. You know, the Swedish government likes to do that to whip up support for dispense spending and kind of fear-monger around Russia and so on. But this is also a basic thing. They're saying the economy in the world is very unstable right now, and that could lead to big prices changes and basic disruption to the economy in Sweden. obviously elsewhere. So there's also this bullwhip effect thing, and I'll explain the bullwhip, and then we'll talk about what a reverse bullwhip is. So this term, it comes from some of the supply chain engineering things and the problems that companies face on the retail side of things. The bullwhip effect, it's very simple to understand on a basic level. A small movement here, a flick of the wrist, creates big downstream movements. Now, typically, companies talk about this in terms of consumer demand. Suddenly, there's a hot new product. Remember when tablets were big? What did the companies do? Everyone started making fucking tablets. Microsoft, Samsung, everyone. Apple obviously has iPad. How many of those tablets stuck around? So a big spike in consumer demand. Then people start producing a bunch of stuff. Oh my God, we gotta have a ton of extra tablets. And then consumer demand drops. They go, oh fuck, stop making tablets. And then consumer demand picks back up. Oh shit, okay, make more tablets. This is kind of the bourgeois political economic way to try to understand some of what happens with what Marx calls the 2-year inventory cycle. But there's also a thing, although it's not much discussed in bourgeois political economy, of effectively a reverse bullwhip effect. On the production side of things, a small movement, or in this case a fairly big movement, creates massive disruptions downstream. Because again, if you're talking about oil, which is input for plastics, which then go into heavy machinery that's used to mine metals that go in microprocessors, that allow computers to run, that are essential for factories to run, you can see how a small disruption here, especially when there's very little redundancy, which there is after a lot of changes to the economy with neoliberalism, creates massive downstream effects, or upstream effects as it were to the consumers. So supply disruptions globally are of the order of the day. Now, the US market may be relatively more stable. The US is a big domestic industrial base. The US is a huge empire, so they can get goods here. But what happens if people all around the world, even if the US is able to keep things relatively in lock on the home front, don't have the basic goods that they expect to have and can't run their factories? What happens if you can't open a factory? Well, you can't make goods. What happens to all those people who are working there? How do they feel about that? And suddenly food's 50% more expensive and fuel's 200% more expensive, and they don't have a job anymore? Yeah, things get a little bit crazy. Then there's the economic reordering of the world. Now this flows from this disruption, but it's not reducible to just to companies going out of business and bullwhip effects and so on. A lot of countries which previously relied on US goods and services are starting to think twice about that. And countries, even close US allies, like Europe, are finally talking about seriously adopting policies of economic statecraft. That is, real efforts to plan at a state level or a whole European level their economy so as to ensure that essential goods are produced at home, or the European market in their case. This economic reordering is not reducible to this. For example, with the end of Dubai, where will there be another major financial center in the region? I mean, maybe Saudi becomes it, although given some of the problems in Saudi and the failures of the NEOM project, I don't really imagine that's going to happen. But it could, for example, be in an African country more closely aligned with China. Or even if one of the Gulf states does sort of hold on to something like Qatar, you can imagine them doing some of what they've already done, which is start to do a lot more business with China, and therefore that have huge downstream effects for how the whole region looks. You can imagine a country in distress in this period taking a major US dollar denominated loan from the Chinese government, again, just riffing off this example, in exchange for opening their country up massively to Chinese investment, Chinese EVs, et cetera, formerly what they couldn't do because the US would have been pissed. And China, by the way, for a lot of countries, is the main source of US dollars these days. This is a result of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. That's a whole topic for another presentation. Let's take a look at how the South Korean stock market is not doing so well. This is today, 12% down. Over the last 2 days, it's gone down about 20%. I think that's the second biggest crash in its history. That's not just some numbers in people's retirement accounts or investment accounts or Robinhood, day trading things while they're doing a bit of coke. I guess like day trading is kind of dead these days, right? After the high frequency trading, but whatever. This is 1/5 of the market capitalization of the publicly traded companies in South Korea. That's not quite 1/5 of the whole economy gone in 2 days in terms of its valuation. You think that's going to shake things up a little bit? Yeah. And this war is just getting started. 1/5 of the value of South Korea's publicly traded companies eliminated in 2 days. It's hard to overstate the impact that would have on South Korea alone. Forget about the entire Asia-Pacific region, because South Korea is a big economic player. Other things are happening. India, that just agreed to stop buying Russian oil, finally, after the US was begging them to for so long with all the Ukraine war stuff, will now be buying Russian oil again. Why? Because India supposedly has 56 days of oil and gas reserves, but actually has way less than that. There's a matter of major controversy in India right now. And every single country around the world is worried about their oil and gas reserves. Japan, which is the biggest of any Asian economy, 256 days of oil and gas reserves, is freaking out. That tells you a little bit of how long they think the war may well last and the scale of disruption. They're saying we're going to face economic depression, actually, in Japan, very likely if we can't deal with this. So how many countries around the world are going to start saying, fuck US sanctions, we don't care. You say, go ahead, try to sanction us. It's either we take your sanctions or we don't have industry. That's the calculus. The ripple effects of the US being unable to use sanctions, or countries being willing to defy them en masse, for the global economy is staggering. The US sanctions, ability to sanction other countries has already vastly decreased over the last decade as they layered sanction after sanction on a wide array of countries and saw them weaken. Saw countries like India willing to use various mechanisms to subvert the sanctions. But it's another thing to have them totally collapse. I'm not saying they're going to totally collapse, but what I'm saying is we're on that road now. As that begins to happen, the predominance of the US dollar globally shrinks. That's already a phenomenon that's ongoing, but this intensifies that. And as that happens, well, the scale of that discussion is too large for even a 2-hour presentation just on that. But there's major, major blows dealt to the US's global dominance. And again, we're 5 days into this war, and things like this are happening. What Trump did today was grant Germany an exemption to US sanctions on Russian oil. This means effectively that US sanctions on Russian oil don't exist in the same way anymore. Because now Germany is allowed to buy, actually I think it's Russian oil, not gas yet, but they'll be able to buy gas. Maybe that's already there too, it's just the oil that's been reported. We'll expect more of that, which means the US's ability to ice Russia out of the global economy and to pull the European Union further away from Russia and China economically is dwindling rapidly. If the US can't keep Europe closely in its orbit and as basically a secondary kind of imperialist powers, sort of loosely affiliated in the EU, under its thumb, its ability to project power globally is drastically reduced. And again, I said this earlier, Spain kicked out the US forces. A European ally kicked out, at the start of this war, the US planes and forces out of its country. In the post-World War II era, how many times has that happened? Oh yeah, 0. 0. I mean, and that was on like day 1 of this war, maybe day 2. Staggering changes in 5 days. And unfortunately, right now, people in the US don't have a sense. I'm trying to, maybe somewhat with dramatic effect of how I'm speaking, give you some clarity on just the scale of the changes that are happening one after another, after another, after another. But I'm just scratching the surface here. And I imagine that events in the coming days will eclipse what we've already seen. This is a rough map from 2020 from Al Jazeera of all the US bases around the world. I mean, you can see all the bases. This is a global empire. And it's breaking apart before our eyes. Again, I'm not trying to say it's collapsing and it's done and Rome is ending. And remember, after the fall of Rome, the Roman Empire continues. We call it the Byzantine Empire. They called themselves the Roman Empire, and that lasted until what, like 1400 roughly. Now, I'm not saying the US is going to last another almost 1,000 years or anything like that, but I want to be clear and not hyperbolic and not say it's the end of the empire. On the other hand, this is the biggest blow the US empire has ever faced, and it's only going to get worse as this war continues. The most clear and obvious thing is the US is about to lose a tremendous amount of influence in the Middle East. The Gulf countries, which won't fight this war for the US, if they're not destroyed, as Dubai, as UAE is partially being, they will pivot more out of the US sphere. At the start of the Ukraine war, for example, Saudi Arabia agreed to various forms of effectively bargaining, including with China, to reduce the amount of US dollar denominated trade they do. This reduced dependence on the US dollar. A lot of countries were very worried about the sanctions that were put on Russia, and in particular the freezing of $600 billion of Russian assets. And they wanted to reduce their exposure and the leverage the US had over them. All those processes now rapidly accelerate. It's important to remember the projection of military power preserves economic power and is tied to economic power. How willing is a country to stand up to the US when the US has a bunch of fucking military bases in their country? If those bases are destroyed, and if US troops are forced out, and the US has to literally decamp from some of these countries, or at least partially decamp, the US influence will wane rapidly. And a centerpiece of not just the US policy in the Middle East, but of US imperialism around the world, which defined what's known as the Bretton Woods II system informally, the system that replaced Bretton Woods I and the gold standard and the institutions that were created at the Bretton Woods Agreement in the immediate wake of World War II, is the US-Saudi alliance in the petrodollar recycling program that cemented the US dollar's continued status as the world reserve currency, even when the US went off the gold standard. I don't think that will fully break. There's a lot of institutions, including outside of the Middle East, that preserve that through what's known as the euro-dollar market. Those are the offshore non-US banks that lend US dollars. They lend around $60 trillion that underwrites the whole global economy. But some sections of this are being broken now. And the petrodollar recycling is essential for US dominance. It's breaking down. As I noted earlier, Israel's continued existence is an open question. I think Israel will probably make it through this war. The Samson option's there too, as I said. I don't know. And I want to be frank, that's crazy that I'm sitting up here saying, I honestly don't know if Israel's going to make it through this war. Just the way they're being hit right now, the subjectivity of their leadership, the immediate defeat they faced. Okay, let me explain a little bit. Right after the war started, Israel decided, it's a great idea when we're being pounded by missiles. Let's open another front of the war. They called up 100,000 IDF reservists and they invaded Lebanon. I said this earlier, right? And they got beaten out of Lebanon. Israeli media reported they retreated. So when that level of military incompetence is at play in the ground wars, you're going to have dissent amongst the troops. I mean, and your country's being bombed and maybe flattened in part, and your military leadership's being picked off, and your spy agencies were infiltrated and exposed, and we'll see, is the short. But it bears watching very closely, and it bears watching in particular what gets through the censorship, which is very intense. The inevitable outcome of this war at this point is Iran will cement itself as a significant regional power. Before this war, Iran had, significant influence in the region. It had some genuine proxies and some forces which are not reducible to proxies. It will establish, I think, a long-term foothold in Iraq. We could see the fall of the al-Qaeda government in Syria. Gilani's forces have promised to intervene in Lebanon. They probably will. I imagine they'll commit some major atrocities and fall apart because they're mostly mercenaries. And I don't think that Israelis really can control them, although they think they can. I imagine that some of Iran's influence in Syria will be increased. Lebanon will change drastically, one way or another, with this war. But I imagine that countries like Qatar, which shares the largest gas field in the world with Iran, will move much closer to Iran. And the US ruling class will have to acknowledge and admit the reality of Iranian influence in the region. Now they can do that two ways. One is to admit retreat and hope to have some like trading relations and normalize even after signing of the treaty. I don't think that's what they do. I think they frantically try, after losing severely in the war, to enforce economic blockades on Iran as it solidifies its position in the region, and then actually basically at that point probably quintuple down on their losses and end up being even more economically isolated in the region as countries basically say, fuck you, we're obviously doing business with Iran. You couldn't defend your bases, you couldn't defend us, you ran out of missiles and interceptors in 4 days. And Iran is promising not to invade us as long as we cut ties with you and instead do business with them, and we're gonna make a hell of a lot of money. The US and the UE, the European Union alliance, is being weakened. This is obvious with Spain, and the German chancellor also condemned Spain to be with Trump, but it goes deeper than that. Because since the start of the Ukraine war, France and Germany have been talking a lot about strategic autonomy, need to be relatively independent from the US and China, and not just have to do whatever the US says, but also not let Chinese EVs and other Chinese tech gobble up their domestic market. They're not really doing that very well, but now the push for it is bigger. And France in particular is leading the charge. I don't know if you all saw Macron's like semi-evil dictator speech while the Marseillaise plays. That was kind of weird. But France has announced that they will no longer publicly disclose the amount of nuclear weapons they have. They plan to rapidly and aggressively expand their nuclear capabilities. And as a side note, the French getting a nuke was sort of one of the main sources of the rift in the 60s, as I mentioned, between the US and France, and that France hopes to put Europe under its nuclear umbrella. Who currently manages the European nuclear umbrella? Oh yeah, the US, by and large. Which means that the European countries don't need US nukes to protect them in the same way anymore from Russia or China. Mostly from Russia is their main concern. Which means the US, a key pillar of the, at least military pillar, of the US-EU alliance breaks down. This is tied with the slide I shared earlier, the image I shared earlier about the greater strategic autonomy in European industry and so on. There's also very possibly moves by rival imperialist powers. I would not be surprised to see Russia make an aggressive push in Ukraine now. I mean, we saw the missile defense system, the radar that the US has in Qatar was essential for maintaining US dominance in the Russian, or not dominance, but US control to some degree in the airspace over Ukraine. That's gone. We'll probably see some push in Ukraine. And I think Zelensky, his days are numbered already anyways. But we'll see exactly how that shakes out. Putin and the Russian ruling class have been very cautious. Poland, which France offered to put under its nuclear umbrella, says, no, we're getting our own nukes. And if Poland's saying they're getting nukes, everyone wants nukes and will be getting them soon. Maybe not literally getting them, but a lot of countries will. We're going to see a massive move of nuclear proliferation, or at least attempts at it. Okay, I've been talking for a while. I have one more slide. I'm going to go through it quickly, but in a sense, it may be the most important slide. And this is mass rebellion. Because the destabilization of the world and other things with food prices, economic breakdown, that's going to be a catalyst for mass rebellion. But we're already seeing mass rebellion very quickly. For example, all over Pakistan, in response to this, people stormed US embassies. In Karachi, they actually succeeded in getting in through the first line and waving an Iranian flag over the embassy, which is pretty crazy. A bunch of people were then shot by the US military, but also by Pakistani security forces. And so then all over, at least in Punjab and northern Pakistan, slogans broke out for death to the politicians and the generals that run the country. Pakistan, for those who haven't followed, has been a pretty unstable country for quite some time. The US has been really trying to maintain its hold on Pakistan and keep the Pakistani ruling class and the generals who run the country in place. Every election cycle, as a reflection of the contradictions, even amongst the Pakistani ruling class, there's often hundreds of assassinations of politicians. And the main opposition leader, Imran Khan, right now is in jail. And he was closer to China than the US and so on. So Pakistan is a powder keg. It's also, Pakistan and India are some of the poorest places in the world. 40% of like the world's stunted children are in those two countries. Not just malnourished, stunted from lack of nourishment. And since the recent floods the last few years in Pakistan, it's been very, very brutal. The government's really tried to keep a lid on mass protests. This could be a spark that intensifies. It's intensified the protest a bit. It could really intensify the protests. But it's not just in Pakistan. In Lucknow, in India, the Shia community there had huge protests, thousands and thousands of people. In Kashmir, where for every 7 Kashmiris, there's one Indian army soldier. It's the most militarized place in the world. It's like literally block by block, there's soldiers. There was huge protests defying the curfews and protesting against the attacks. And the Kashmiri people are very, very brave. They've been fighting against this Indian occupation for so long, and they really came out against this. In Greece, there was huge protests in Athens surrounding the US embassy. And Greece having fought against a lot of stuff, neoliberal austerity, Golden Dawn, fascist movement, other things. There's quite a militant movement there. There's some pretty cool other photos I was going to include more of, like people waving these big red flags as they're surrounding the US embassy. The workers' movement there has there's a bunch of different groups, but there's some real strong stuff there. In the Philippines, there was huge protests. There's one of the biggest revolutionary movements in the world in the Philippines, and a very strong communist party there. And so you have these really great signs: stop U.S. Israel war in Iran, down with U.S. imperialism, and there's a bunch more. I just got a few of them. For 50 years, there's been a revolutionary struggle in the Philippines, and it's going strong. And so these sort of exposures of U.S. imperialism, which is the main oppressor of the people in the Philippines, and the U.S. has a bunch of bases there, and soldiers commit all sorts of atrocities. There's a real anger against it, and this sort of mass attack on a whole country and the whole region, really, with this war. And especially if the U.S. suffers defeat after defeat, inspires people to fight back. And then, of course, there's here in the U.S. where we don't have big protests, but trust in the U.S. government is pretty close to an all-time low. Right around Occupy Wall Street, it was a little lower. But you know, we've got some openings coming here. And this is the point I'll end it on. I want to be clear. The situation in the world is very unstable. The existing mass arrest that we're seeing the first few days is significant. As people begin to realize the US empire is not, in fact, an invincible behemoth, but rather, as Lenin put it, a giant with clay feet, or as Mao put it, a paper tiger. A giant with clay feet is still big and strong. A paper tiger, as Mao said, it's still dangerous, it can bite you, but it's also paper, it has weaknesses, vulnerabilities. When people really internalize that logic, the fact that there is a possibility of fighting back and winning, we'll see a lot of change. Right now, a huge reason the US is not seething with more rebellion. It's not like things aren't bad here, fucked up. There's all sorts of oppression going on. We have this ICE stuff, we have just the ongoing racist police brutality, we have just extreme abject poverty, not to mention like what the Me Too movement revealed about how rotten the society is, like all levels. We have a lot of mass outrage, but that's kept in check. And there's a helpful thing to remember, actually, a lesson from the Chinese Revolution. When the revolution happened, as part of the agrarian revolution, the overthrowing of the landlords, China was semi-feudal with all these landlords there that kept people in chains for generations. They would have these meetings once the military power of the landlords had been broken locally. And people would get up and they'd speak their grievances. It's called speak bitterness sessions. People would expose the crimes of the landlords. And some people would talk about more recent things, but some people get up. Grandparents who had maybe never protested a day in their life, kept their head down and just kind of gotten by and tried to not get killed or abused or beaten by the landlord. Beatings and even being sold into slavery and stuff was pretty common in feudal China. They maybe never spoke up in their life. They would stand up and they'd say, my whole life, I've seen what you did. You did this to my grandparents, you did it to my parents, you did it to me, you did it to my kids and my grandkids, and they just speak out. It would flow out of them. They didn't forget. They didn't forget for a minute the injustices that were perpetuated against them, their family, and everyone around them. And it's very important to remember that where there's oppression, there's resistance. People may, for a time, be cowed down, be quiet, not say it, but they don't forget. And when things break down, as they're beginning to break down now, a seething outpouring of mass anger and outrage will emerge. It'll happen slower here. and starting in the most oppressed countries in the world, India and Pakistan. It's no coincidence I'm showing you the protests from there because those are some of the most oppressed places in the world. But it'll spread around the world, and people will be inspired by what they see. Iran fighting back against the US and Israel and the various movements, Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, etc. And things are going to change rapidly. The question for us here in the US is, well, first of all, to engage with that as best we can, and especially to rally the working class movement around that. And as major disruptions to production happen, there will be big openings for them. But it's also to not be caught flat-footed. A huge assumption, operating assumption, most of us have, having grown up in relatively peaceful times. And to be clear, peaceful times are brutal for the people under capitalism. But an operating assumption we have is things aren't going to change so much. I'm going to basically have my life be fairly stable. Things get a little shittier. Maybe some more bad things will happen from the government, but like it's going to basically be the same. I mean, we had the Patriot Act, 9/11, all this stuff. Things kind of stay the same. Things got worse, but they kind of stay the same. First of all, that's kind of an illusion. We kind of retconned that and assumed things were the same. Things were a lot different before 9/11. Not that they were great, but things got pretty crazy after that. But also, it is the case that the instability that's coming is of a much greater degree. And I made this comparison earlier. I don't know how many of you before COVID hit followed COVID, when it was happening, and the outbreak happened in China, and so on. I did. And there was this weird period of like 2 months where I was like, oh shit, maybe this will be really bad. And also, holy shit, I read an article by William Arkin. He's saying the US government has plans for martial law if this got a hand. And holy shit, they're talking about lockdowns. They're doing lockdowns elsewhere. I remember talking to people, myself and others were doing some organizing on college campuses at the time. We're like, guys, like this could be crazy. There could be real big disruptions. People might die from COVID. We weren't clear how much it was going to be. There's going to be lockdowns. We told people before spring break, like, you're not coming back after spring break. People thought I was crazy. It was a bit of a weird feeling, like, whoa, like I know things are changing and people don't realize it yet. There's not mass recognition. I hope I've convinced you that things are changing very rapidly in the world right now. And as communists, as revolutionaries, even if you're not either of those things, you just consider yourself a leftist who wants to see better change in the world, we need to be a step ahead, or multiple steps ahead of the present development, to see the course and to show other people the course. But that can be scary. First, because we've got to face that things are changing. But second, and this is very important to internalize, because most people in the US fear less being wrong and fear more social backlash. And actually, if you read the US military manuals on PSYOPs, they say this is something they encourage. They don't want a population that will go against the tide and stand for something that's right, even if they face backlash. They say people are very easy to control and manipulate if they're afraid of social backlash. Now, I'm not saying we should seek out social backlash, but if we see things are changing and people might look at us a little like, what? What do you mean? We can't be afraid of that. We have to be willing to stand firm and say, no, look, here's how things are changing, and here's what I think is going to happen, and here's what we should try to do about it. As opposed to being like, oh, I'm probably right, but people are going to think I'm weird for talking about this. Well, they're going to look weird in 6 months when the world's a lot different and they were caught sleeping. And that's something of a bit of an aside, but hopefully it's some encouragement to really take seriously and face with some courage the changes that are coming. I'll say one final thing. I know I said this would be the last thing, but it's one more. After the defeat of the 1905 revolution, and 1905 is an important referent because it happened in Russia after the Russian military was defeated by the Japanese. There was an attempt at a revolution. People were very angry and confused and didn't believe in the power of the Russian state and the Tsar in the same way. But the revolution was defeated. After it was defeated, Lenin assumed that he would never see a revolution in Russia in his lifetime. He was proven wrong by the course of events. I'm not saying there will necessarily be a revolution in our lifetimes here in the US, but what the first 5 days of this war have shown is that the seeming power of the US empire is in fact a lot less than we thought, and that they're much more vulnerable, and the reverberations of their vulnerability will be felt the world over, but especially domestically. Okay, thank you all, and we'll do some Q&A.